My salutation to the readers of the Fundamentals of the Hyperborean Wisdom. In the name of the Tyrrhodal Knights and in his own, the author offers a comrade's salute, i.e., a sign of honor, to those who have been chosen in two worlds to receive the fundamentals of the Hyperborean Wisdom. To those who have this book in their hands, and who have received it from ours, we welcome and wish you luck on the first test, its reading and comprehension. The success of such a test will depend on future steps, the Hyperborean initiation, the neither spatial nor temporal but strategic transit toward the Zelpst, toward terrestrial Hyperborea, toward Thule, toward Agatha, toward Valhalla, toward Venus, toward the origin, toward the original Hyperborea, outside of the demented material universe created by the One, toward the eternity of the Spirit, near the incognizable God and Christos Lucifer, the great chief of the race of the Hyperborean spirits. 2. Mission of the Tyrrhodal Knights. The Tyrrhodal Knights are initiates of the Hyperborean Wisdom and are also its depositories in this part of the world. To the Tyrrhodal Knights, the Hyperborean Wisdom was directly entrusted by the loyal Siddhas of Agatha. But the loyal Siddhas did not encourage the constitution of the Order of Tyrrhodal Knights only so that the study of the Hyperborean Wisdom be carried out. On the contrary, from the beginning, a specific mission was entrusted to the Order, for the execution of which it was necessary to have, perhaps for the first time with so much profundity, the Hyperborean Wisdom. The objective of the mission is very simple to state, although its metaphysical background will be difficult for the chosen ones to grasp right away. The mission of the Tyrrhodal Knights is to locate the chosen ones and, if they accept it, initiatically prepare them to face the coming end of history with honor. This statement will surely be made clearer if we define what is to be understood by locating the chosen ones and what the coming end of history means. This will be explained below. 3. The mission of the Tyrrhodal Knights requires locating the chosen ones and revealing to them the fundamentals of Hyperborean Wisdom. First of all, it is worth affirming that the chosen ones to whom we refer are persons whose inclination for the Hyperborean Wisdom does not come from a rational decision adopted in the course of their lives. The chosen one is the one who, paradoxically, chose to fight against Jehovah Satan in order to free the eternal spirit, who is himself, from material enchainment. But such a choice, the chosen one did not make in this life or on this earth, but on another plane of existence, neither spatial nor temporal, where the enchained Hyperborean spirit resides. However, although the decision to fight for the freedom of the spirit is made, each new incarnation causes its partial oblivion. The chosen one, at the moment of being located by the Tyrrhodal Knights, is asleep. The first act must consist, then, in awakening them to the memory of their own decision. It thus becomes necessary to hold a dialogue with the sleeping chosen one in order to procure that he awakens in him his spiritual nature. But this dialogue, in order to be effective, must overcome all the cultural fences that the enemy has erected in the interior of his psychic structure and be directly directed to the manifestation of the spirit. Naturally, such a dialogue cannot be emptied counting only on a profane language. This book, as will be explained further ahead, has the purpose of teaching the chosen one a method of thought that will enable him to comprehend the metaphysical significance of the concepts expressed by the Tyrrhodal Knights. That is why, prior to the reading of this book, it is not possible to satisfy any question of the chosen one about the mystery of the Hyperborean initiation and the possibility of spiritual liberation, and also reading it will only be possible if it has been comprehended and accepted. The chosen one, although asleep, exhibits unmistakable signs of who he is. Fundamentally, there are two inheritances, one genetic and the other spiritual. The genetic inheritance consists of the blood's mnemic content, the memory of the origin, which is all the more intense the purer the blood is. That is why the Hyperborean Wisdom distinguishes between blood purity and racial purity. The lahasha is not an essential requirement for the Hyperborean initiation, although the former is, because without blood purity, without the memory of the origin, there is no possibility of spiritual liberation. As for the spiritual inheritance, it manifests itself in the volitive character of the ego. As will be demonstrated in this book, the ego is a consequence of the spiritual enchainment, hence its aspect immediately reveals the degree of the chosen one's straying and submission. Because of their mastery of the Hyperborean wisdom, the Tyrrhodal Knights have the most perfect methods of establishing whether a person is a chosen one and, if he is a chosen one, to what degree he is astray, and when the Tyrrhodal Knights have accurately determined that a person is a chosen one, and that his awakening is possible, it is then that the consultation to the loyal Siddhas, those who never err, is made, so that they confirm or reject the judgment of the order. There is, then, no mistake if a chosen one is convoked to participate in the Hyperborean wisdom. It signifies that, in two worlds, his awakening is considered possible. 4. The mission of the Tyrrhodal Knights proposes to the chosen ones the Hyperborean initiation, in order to face the coming end of history with honor. Nothing can be advanced here about the Hyperborean initiation. Only he who has studied step by step, and comprehended the fundamentals of the Hyperborean wisdom, will be able to glimpse into what it consists in. The second part of this book, which has been bound separately, is already an introduction to the Hyperborean initiation, and there the subject is developed in great detail. However, this part of the fundamentals will only be given to those chosen ones who have manifested their conformity with the mission of the order and have assumed the commitment to continue until being initiated. In any case, the important thing now is to emphasize that those who continue along the proposed path and receive the Hyperborean initiation will be in a position to face the coming end of history with honor. There are multiple paths that the misguided man of our days can take. Some are parallel and even coincidental with some tactical path of the loyal Siddhas' strategy. Others, most, are paths that favor the plans of the enemy or are traps designed to prevent such plans from being undermined. Each one must discern, as far as possible, which is the path of his convenience. Wrong or not, his choice is of no interest whatsoever to the order of Tyrrhodal Knights. The order, in fact, is not made up of judges but of Hyperborean Kshatriyas, of warriors of the end of history. Their mission is not to judge the current time, much less to condemn anyone, but to train the chosen ones in order to face, with honor, the end of history, the inevitable struggle that will ensue and that will encompass several worlds in its theater of operations. This is the mission entrusted to the order by the loyal Siddhas, and the Tyrrhodal Knights guard the path that leads to this end. Whoever follows along this particular path must comprehend and accept that, although the Hyperborean wisdom of which they are the depositaries would make it possible, the Tyrrhodal Knights will not attempt to twist the course of history. And whoever does not agree with this condition may, as has been said, take the path that best suits him, especially if he believes that something of this world deserves to be saved. The Hyperborean wisdom is not suited to weak natures. The Hyperborean initiate must exhibit a heart of ice and a will of fire. At this time, the principal variables of history are controlled by the enemy. The white hierarchy of Changshambhala sustains the agents of the international synarchy in the bosom of all the cultures of the earth. They, thousands of men and organizations of every type and function, work for the concretion of the world government. Behind the white hierarchy are the traitorous Siddhas, the ancients responsible for the spiritual enchainment. Their pact with the demiurge obliges them to enthrone the sacred races over humanity. The present sacred race of the demiurge is the Hebrew race, and to it will be transferred the power of the world government. Should the objective of this infamous conspiracy be concretized, the certain consequence would be an even more intense materialization of man and his collective moral degradation. Naturally, the enemy takes the success of its plan as a given and does not consider the end of history possible. But the loyal Siddhas, those who remain faithful to Christos Lucifer since the origin, are sure the end of history is imminent. At a moment of maximum dramatic tension, when the enemy plans seem to be fulfilled, they will intervene in order to put an end to history. It will be a conflict of gods in which men will also participate, a conflict that will initiate in heaven and spread to earth, and not the inverse. Therefore, there is no point in prematurely engaging in the fight, in a confrontation where the enemy forces are overwhelmingly superior. The wisdom is, and wise will be the chosen ones who understand it, in preparing to face the end of history with honor. And to prepare the chosen ones, awakening in them the memory of the origin, the certainty of the eternal spirit enchained in Mahashur, teaching the noological ethics of the Hyperborean wisdom, the practice of which enables accessing the initiation, and administering, at last, the Hyperborean initiation, is the mission of the Order of Tyrrhodal Knights. When the end of history comes, the loyal Siddhas will manifest themselves in the light of day, and with them will return the Führer, the envoy of the Lord of War. Then the chosen ones whose honor is called valor, i.e., the Hyperborean initiates of the Order of Tyrrhodal Knights, will line up behind their ancient spiritual chiefs in order to definitively depart from the material universe. In synthesis, the mission of the Order of Tyrrhodal Knights consists in this, in locating the chosen ones and, if they accept it, initiatically preparing them to face the coming end of history with honor. The Hyperborean initiates, by mastering the Hyperborean wisdom, reach the highest level of esoteric knowledge, the science of the runes, and acquire terrible powers. However, they do not use their powers to alter the course of history. They await, however, the end of history, when definitively settling the score with the enemy. The chosen ones must comprehend and accept that this condition is unavoidable in order to transit along the path that the Tyrrhodal Knights point out and guard. Warning and final salute. The chosen ones have to know from the outset that this material is confidential. The Order has trusted in them by providing it, and they must demonstrate their loyalty by being prudent in its handling. That way they not only protect the Order but protect themselves. It goes without saying, and it is no concession to admit it, that the enemy of the Hyperborean wisdom is terrible and ruthless and does not consent to or tolerate the mission of the Order. Respecting the law of secrecy is part of the test, and the Order possesses the means to know who commits infidelity or treason. No one for whom honor does not imply his loyalty will be able to join an order of initiates for whom their honor is valor. As will become clear when reading the fundamentals, the Hyperborean initiate, the awakened Virya, is he who has remembered that there is a metaphysical war and that his side is that of Christos Lucifer. In that war, which has been going on for millions of years, both sides combat each other without truce or pardon. The Hyperborean initiates must be relentless because the enemy is relentless. And in the midst of such a fierce conflict, the common man, the chosen one perhaps, lacks value for both sides because he does not know the strategies at play and does not fulfill any tactical function. But the situation will brusquely change for the chosen one from the very moment he receives this material. From then on, the war that he was always unaware of will become evident, and powerful psychic forces will act to induce him to defection or to commit an irreparable error. The chosen one must realize that if until today he did not act consciously in favor of any of the sides, reading the contents of this book does not make him sympathetic in the enemy's eyes, and that his situation will not change because he betrays the Order by imprudently divulging this material. On the other hand, what can occur is that the doors of the Order close to him, and that the enemy, also having deceived him into profaning the Hyperborean wisdom, becomes enraged with him and destroys him without mercy. This is what happens in those cases. It is understood, then, that the warning is more to protect the chosen one than the Order, which, on the other hand, knows how to take care of itself. Finally, we will make another warning, this time about the way the work should be read. The fundamentals of the Hyperborean wisdom are systematically unfolded, in such a way that the sections, articles, and commentaries are linked to one another with precise reasonings and conclusions. It is not possible to skip anything, and, on the contrary, the maximum benefit will be obtained as a result of a linear study, from the first to the last page. Also such a linear reading, which will allow an overview of the Hyperborean wisdom, it will be possible to go deeper, regardless of order, into those topics that require greater comprehension. It is advisable that the chosen ones internalize the fundamentals of the Hyperborean wisdom as soon as possible, and for that, it is necessary that this lecture now concludes. Many of the questions raised here will be answered with the turning of the pages. However, the question of questions, the fundamental ethical question of the Hyperborean wisdom, what must I do to free my spirit from its material prison, must remain unanswered, at least for the time being. The author, and the Tyrrhodal Knights, wish to assure the chosen ones that the Order offers that answer to those who comprehend and accept the fundamentals of the Hyperborean wisdom and wish to join in its mission. On the day of the Spirit, and in the name of the loyal Siddhas of Agatha, and of the Order of Tyrrell Knights of the Argentine Republic, the chosen ones receive the salute of Nimrod de Rosario, August 1985. Introduction to the fundamental thesis of Hyperborean wisdom. The object of this Hyperborean metaphysics is to pontificate on the most mysterious and sacred subject that exists, the drama of the captive spirit in Mahashur. Here, the method that is used is the following. A relationship of analogy is established between a certain traditionally esoteric metaphysical truth and a particularly exoteric and well-described example. Once the relationship has become clear, we proceed to extend the particular to the general through induction. In this way, it is possible to induce in the student the metaphysical intuition of inexplicable realities. He pontificates, i.e., he joins, with a bridge, the shores of the intelligible and the Gnostic. The thesis of the Hyperborean wisdom that we fundament in this part cannot be simpler to present and, nevertheless, more complicated to explain. In other words, it is relatively easy to mythically present the original features of the drama, the treason of the Siddhas and the fall of the spirit, but the intelligible approximation to said myth cannot be more difficult. An initiatic route, in which the instructor puts the student into direct contact with the myth, would undoubtedly save us all the trouble. But this is not the case. Here we must show the truth of the thesis by means of rational explanations, i.e., with concepts determined by the logic of language. And we will do so because we are stimulated by the certainty that the chosen path is the right one, that anyone who transits it, with a minimum of apprehension, will at some point be able to cross the metaphysical bridge that leads to the spirit, to his own spirit, captive by the gods of Mahashur. Let us begin, then, with the principle of the thesis. The Hyperborean wisdom teaches that before the arrival of the Hyperborean spirits to the material universe, the earth was inhabited by an extremely primitive hominid denominated Pasu. Such a hominid, however, was potentially called in order to fulfill an important function in the work of the demiurge, to be a giver of meaning in the world, a finality that will be explained in detail further ahead. It is of interest here to point out that the Pasu had failed as a species in the fulfillment of its finality and, as it occurs in all cases in which evolution takes wrong paths, its certain destiny was extinction. What miracle saved it from disappearing like the dinosaur or the dodo and instead accelerated its evolution until converting it into the master of the earth? Answer: the genetic contribution of an extraterrestrial race called, as of late, Hyperborean. But it is not only a Mahashur of genetics, i.e., of hereditary information. What has made the genetic modification of the Pasu possible is the spiritual enchainment of extraterrestrial beings to the evolutive development of the Manu archetypes, in other words, to the evolution of Ma. This primordial act, which constitutes the nucleus of the thesis, is denominated white treason or treason of the Siddhas, in clear allusion to the extraterrestrial chiefs who led the fall of the spirits, produced a mutation in the vegetable and animal kingdoms of Earth, and, even today, control the planet from the Changshambhala center. As an effect of the treason of the traitorous Siddhas, three classes of men appeared on Earth: the primitive hominid, which from then on was called animal man or Pasu; the Pasu who possesses Hyperborean lineage, i.e., the Pasu who has the possibility of manifesting in himself the captive spirit, denominated Virya; and the Hyperborean Siddha, which can be, both a spirit liberated from captivity, as one of the ancient guides, and who remain on Earth, in a place called Agatha, in order to combat the enemy and consummate the final rescue of the captive spirits. The man of today is, to a greater or lesser extent, a lost Virya. That is to say, in him there is a double nature, divine and human, just as the Gnostics of the first centuries of the present era were rightly affirming, and that the Church exclusively reserved for an exponent of the demiurge Jehovah Satan's sacred race. In effect, the double nature that the Church affirms Jesus Christ was possessing is, in reality, the natural condition of every Virya, who participates in the absolute divinity of the eternal Spirit. To hide this fact, and to prevent man from becoming a god, the Church began by destroying Gnosis with a relentless persecution and continued by taking possession of the truth in order to solely apply it to Jesus Christ. Also the treason of Constantine to the gods of the Roman Empire, and the Council of Nicaea and those subsequent to it, the Gnostic truth of the double nature of the Virya was transformed into the dogma of the divinity of Jesus Christ. And every subsequent attempt to reveal this secret to men, from the Manichaeans and Cathars, to Nietzsche and Hitler, was drowned in blood by the synarchic conspiracy of Judeo-Masonry, Judeo-Marxism, Judeo-Christianity, etc. The primitive Pusu was a phase in the evolutive process of the Manu archetype. They had arrived to that status an evolution of millions of years that had not begun here but on another planet, which was later divided into 4 parts and formed the moons of Earth. In this lack of individuality resided, precisely, the evolutive failure of the Pusu. In other sections, it will be demonstrated that the demiurge proposed a finality for the destiny of the Pusu, the objective of which is double. The microcosmic objective of the finality requires that the Pusu develop the conscious sphere and convert the microcosm into an autonomous entity, capable of placing meaning on the macrocosm. This objective also allows the macrocosmic objective of the finality to be fulfilled, producing culture. It is understood that the first objective, to develop the conscious sphere, is particular, and the second, to produce culture, is collective. The lack of individuality, the incipient pre-conscious sphere, the natural and insuperable animality, caused the failure of the microcosmic objective of the finality, and such a particular stagnation produced, in consequence, the failure of the macrocosmic objective. Pusu cultures did not progress in thousands of years. On the other hand, it should be noted that, in the general sense, the Pusu was exhibiting a highly developed gregarious instinct that was enabling them to surpass, in organization, any other animal society, since it was the only one capable of creating a culture. However, for not being totally individualized, it was participating, along with other members of its community, in a kind of group soul, or egregor, endowed with a certain intelligence but the principal motivation of which was desire. In synthesis, the spiritual enchainment was perpetrated by the traitorous siddhas so that the Pusu could comply with the double objective of its finality, to develop the conscious subject and produce culture. Why they did such a thing? By what means were they able to do so? The answers to these, and other similar questions, can be found in the following sections. This is, in general terms, the thesis that we develop here. Its apparent simplicity should not give rise to misunderstandings because, if we wish to transcend the mythical language and clarify the mystery, we would have to pose very complex questions. For example, let us consider the topic of the enchained spirit. If we take as an actual fact, although very ancient, the fallen captivity of the spirit and we procure to make it largely intelligible, we must start by asking, how is it enchained to Mahashur, to the ephemerality of life, to the becoming of nature, to the cycles of life and death? How is, we repeat, an eternal spirit enchained to that illusion? Answer: above all, one must affirm that the solution constitutes a terrible secret, known in the Hyperborean wisdom as the mystery of Amor and of love. Than the demiurge himself, remains enchained because it does not know that it is. How can this be possible? It is not difficult to imagine if we consider that there was an original treason, in other words, a breach of a trust or loyalty that the members of the Hyperborean race owed to each other. If we count on this exterior dynamic element, treason, we can then suppose that the spirits were exhibiting a weak point in their complexion, a back, an Achilles heel, etc., by which they were dominated. But, even so, it is difficult to understand how an act so transcendental to the spirit could occur, the loss of freedom, the enchainment to Mahashur and to time, etc., unbeknownst to it, neither then nor afterward, and remaining so. And such a difficulty in order to understand it demonstrates how far we are from the spirit, from our eternal ego. We reiterate that, despite the above-mentioned difficulties, it is possible to broadly explain the thesis and intuitively apprehend the inexplicable by means of transcendental induction. The first part of the fundamentals is dedicated to achieving such an objective. But, it is worth clarifying, it would not be possible to make intelligible the the spirit's enchainment to the evolution of the Pusu without an adequate previous description of the psychic structure of the Pusu. This is what will demand the most effort, although, since in each Virya still exists a significant part of the Pusu, its comprehension will offer no problems to the student. The necessity for an analogical model of the Hyperborean spirit. Our purpose is, then, to demonstrate by means of analogies how the spirits were enchained to Mahashur without knowing it and, especially, what this weak point in the spiritual complexion consists in. But we must warn that the hypothesis that we present can only correspond to the case of a spirit that has entered into the universe and, therefore, has been situated to levels of rational quantification. Nothing can be known about the form, or the mode of being of a spirit situated outside of the material universe, and it would be a useless task to attempt to represent it. Instead, the model that we offer will help us to imagine a member of the cosmic race, which will be, naturally, very different from what we are accustomed to see or conceive. Such a model will enable us to intuit how it was possible to deceive and defeat the spirit without it noticing, and why, also, it remained unaware of the state in which it was. As many of the metaphysical fundamentals presented in this book are based on the model of the sphere, it is convenient to clarify from the outset what can be expected and how far it reflects the reality of the spirit. In this sense, we should say that in the conception of the model, the conceptual correspondence has been ended to before the merely formal one. In this way it is possible that the enunciation of qualities or properties of the model connote qualities or properties of the spirit. The model of the sphere keeps this conceptual correspondence with the Hyperborean spirit that should allow a metaphysical intuition, which is neither sensible nor intelligible but Gnostic, to carry out the sort-osa transit toward the spirit. This is what we can expect from such a model. It will not be necessary, we suppose, to stress too much that the spirit is not spherical by the fact that the model is. What remains invariant in the correspondence is the topology and not the geometric shape. The analogical concepts are deduced from the topological invariants and their physical consequences. On the contrary, he who goes from the model to the spirit will transcend the spherical, will situate himself beyond his entity, on the plane of absolute being, i.e., in the vril. The model of the sphere let us consider, then, a hollow sphere, of a homogeneous substance. It is, topologically, of a bilateral surface. One side constitutes the interior spherical surface and the other the exterior surface. Let us now suppose that this hollow sphere represents an eternal spirit before the fall. Each one of the infinite points of the interior surface is a nucleus of absolute gnosis that is facing toward the center. In the center, at a point situated in the hollow interior space, all the eyes of the Gnostic points converge and there a total synthesis of wisdom is realized. It can be said that in the center of the spiritual sphere, there is an absolute ego, which knows about each point of its being because, justly, it is the synthesis of all those points. How does a being like that act? Contracting or expanding its volume and applying its absolute will in the interior space. If the absolute ego wants, it can contract the surface until almost to the point of confusion with the central point, or it can expand it and create as much interior space as that of an entire universe, and if it desires, also, it can organize said interior space and become a pantocrator, as Abraxas once did. But the spirit is not a demiurge, it has no interest in remaining in the world of matter and energy, it comes from the incognizable and there it must return. How it arrived to this demented world? Accompanying the race, following the chiefs, for the aim or of her, perhaps. But whatever the reason, the fact remains that the spirit sphere was then there. But it was not like that, similar to a bubble, before entering the universe of the One. This is the hostile shape with which its nature adapted to the madness of that organized chaos. The essential hostility of the spirit toward the material order of the demiurge manifested in that confinement with which the absolute ego was spherically enclosed. In the center of the sphere shone the flame of the absolute ego, which was contemplated from all points of itself. Outside the sphere the organized chaos, the madness of Abraxas, reigned everywhere. Out there, then, the eternal spirit was not looking, and that not looking was constituting its hostility. Well, the Lahashur is not entirely true, because the spirit was observing toward the exterior from at least one point. Yes, a point, a single point on the entire exterior spherical surface, by which it was contemplating its sphere. Yes. And this single point was undoubtedly the weak point, the origin of the fall. Ascension, we will not say why it occurred or how it occurred. It would be useless to pretend to explain the mystery of Amor with such a simple allegory. We will instead give a description of what occurred to the spirit sphere. In such a what will be symbolized the idea of the fall of the eternal spirit that will enable us to finally comprehend the enchainment to Mahashur or, Behashur still, the double nature of the Virya. In Figure 1 a bubble has been drawn of a very elastic material, rubber for example. At point K, situated in the interior, a cord is firmly soldered, which runs through the diameter and exits the exterior through the antipode, i.e., through the perforation of point H. The cord has at its outermost exterior an eye, E, through which it is possible to hook and pull. Supposing that the bubble is kept in place at all times, what do we believe will happen when you pull outward from the EI? Undoubtedly, in the beginning, a deformation will occur. Momentarily, the spherical shape will be lost, point K will come closer to the perforation of H and the rubber bubble will crinkle from behind. But, if it is pulled enough, soon it will be seen that the interior part begins to come out to the exterior. Figure 1 theoretically, if we continue to pull, we will get the whole interior surface to take the place of the exterior surface and, consequently, the exterior surface will transfer to the interior of the bubble. In the end, we will again obtain the spherical shape, but inverted. The surface that before was inside is now outside. It is necessary to make an effort and imagine this process completely. For this, it is best to set initial chromatic conditions as, for example, that the bubble be red on the outside and green on the inside. In this way it will be possible to imagine how the interior green skin will emerge through the H orifice and how, in the end, the totality of the red color will have crossed over to the interior, whereas the exterior surface will have turned totally green. The reversion of the spirit produces absolute disorientation. If we have been able to imagine the reversion of the bubble, we can go a step further and suppose that something similar occurred to the spirit sphere. Naturally, there was no cord in the spirit that it was possible to pull. But if there was an interior point that was looking to the exterior, i.e., a point that was meeting the conditions of K and H simultaneously, this point enabled the traitorous siddhas to effectuate a reversion in the spirit spheres, similar to that which we have imagined in the bubble of rubber. Let us now draw some conclusions. Let us consider the spirit sphere before the reversion. We must agree that when all of the infinite points of the interior surface look toward the center, such a state constitutes the normality of the spirit sphere. We have said that these were Gnostic points. This does not mean that the wisdom of the Hyperborean spirits is fragmented or pulverized into point units. The Gnostic points concept is allegorical, proper to the spirit sphere, and inseparable from the geometric concept of surface that we are using. The normality consists, then, in all the Gnostic points, except one, looking toward the center of the sphere, where shines the absolute ego, the synthesis of the spirit sphere. The center is, in fact, the cardinal point of the interior surface. But to speak of the cardinal point is to allude to an orientation, that is to say, the cardinal point constitutes the orient of the interior gnosis, the site to which all directions, all routes, all senses relate. Only one point is disoriented, and it is out of Amor, that need for her that is prior to the origin, and that is why it is incomprehensible. On the other hand, the spirit, upon entering through the origin to the universe of the One, does so as an enemy. That is why it adapts in the shape of a spirit sphere and thus demonstrates its essential hostility. We recognize, then, two normalities in the spirit sphere, the interior normality or orientation and the exterior normality or hostility. The treason of the traitorous siddhas was an operation carried out on the exterior point of the spirit sphere. We can suppose, only suppose, that the effect of such an operation produced in the spirit sphere the belief that her sphere was right in front of the exterior point. But whatever the deception or belief of the spirit sphere was, it is certain that its being was instantaneously reverted, in a manner similar to how it occurred with the bubble in Figure 1. Why did the spirit sphere react in such a way? Sphere acted correctly but out of place. That is to say, its reaction was undoubtedly appropriate there. in the incognizable world of the origin, imprudently carried out here, in the universe of Mahashur and energy, in the time consciousness of the demiurge, of the archetypal potency, it led the spirit sphere to a sad end. The defeat was consummated, then, in an instant, without a fight and without a defense. The spirit sphere instantaneously went from being to not knowing, from absolute orientation to absolute disorientation or confusion. The normal spirit sphere in order Bhashur comprehend the state of the spirit sphere also the fall, let us establish some precisions about its normal constitution. In principle, let us take the material plane as a reference and agree that it is below the spirit sphere. This is how the essential hostility manifests as an opposition to said plane. Figure 2. The confrontation was arranged like this: an absolutely free spirit against an absolutely determined or ordered material plane. Let us move on to describe the normality of the spirit sphere. As observed in the figure, we have drawn a section of the spirit sphere in which the Gnostic interior surface has been marked with the color green and the hostile exterior surface with red. If this is the initial situation of the drama of the spirit, then the following principles are valid. First, the body of the spirit, i.e., the sphere, can be considered as comprised of two layers or strata, of two superimposed films, which are in reality two faces. The exterior surface, red, is the expression of the tergum hostis or hostile back; the interior surface, green, is the expression of the vultus spiritus or spiritual face. Second, according to the layout of Figure 2, the opposition or hostility is toward the inferior material plane, in which case, analogically, has been represented with the sphere above and the material plane below. It is evident, then, that the effective opposition is carried out by the lower half of the sphere. For the purposes of reaching a profound comprehension, let us disregard for a moment the upper half of the sphere and only consider that part that exercises an effective opposition to Mahashur. We can distinguish, in Figure 3, two opposing directions. The spiritual face is oriented to the cardinal point of the absolute ego, the hostile back is opposed to the lower Mahashur. Figure 3 tie of the spirit is indicated by the convex, seen from the absolute ego. The orientation of spiritual gnosis is marked by the concave. Third, the spiritual face is pure gnosis and its synthesis consists in an absolute ego situated at the center of the sphere. The hostile back, consequently, is not a wisdom in any way. On the contrary, it is only a hostility because it does not constitute a knowledge of the exterior deception. The spirit sphere has presented itself in the material universe closed in on itself, turned around the absolute ego, and showing to the demiurge a hostile back from every side. But the tergum, the back, is opposed to the demiurge, not as an opposite but as an adversary because, we must affirm, the spirit sphere is a god more potent than the demiurge. Fourth, the spirit sphere opposed to the material plane, as seen in Figure 2, is as immutable as the being of Parmenides. Even the concept of the philosopher of Elia could apply to the spirit sphere and thus say, the spirit is and what the spirit is not, it is not. In other words, in Figure 2 we see, on one hand the spirit sphere, absolutely free, eternal, and immutable, this is what the spirit is; on the other hand we see an absolutely determined world, temporal and phenomenic, this is what the spirit is not. And in consequence, for the spirit, this that is not, does not exist, is an illusion, in other words, it is not. The only reality is the spirit, it alone is. But the demiurge is also a spirit, therefore he is the adversary. Hence it is necessary to distinguish between the Pantocrator and the world, i.e., between the plasmating God and the world plasmated by him, between the demiurge and the ordered universe. The Mahashur forms the material plane, toward which points the negation of the spirit sphere. The material world is pure appearance, pure illusion, pure phenomenon, pure evolutive process, pure contingency and accident. For the spirit the world does not exist, it is not. But the demiurge is, and against him the combat will be fought for the return to the origin, for the recovery of the primordial state, which here we allegorically represent with the spherical form. Summarizing these principles, we can say that the spirit sphere, initially, possesses a spiritual face, green and interior, that looks toward the absolute ego, which is its Gnostic synthesis, and that such a gaze constitutes the normal orientation of the spirit. We also know that it exhibits a hostile back, reddened exterior, which is opposed to the material plane, and that such an opposition is the normal hostility of the spirit. The reverted spirits fear what the demiurge or any other similar demon never would have been able to achieve, i.e., the alteration of the spirit sphere, came to be accomplished by way of betrayal. In effect, they were other members of the Hyperborean race, knowers of all the secrets of the spirit sphere, who broke the principle of loyalty and precipitated millions of spirits to the abyss. They, the traitorous Siddhas, revealed the secret of the exterior point and made possible the deception and the reversion of the spirit sphere. Such a situation has been represented in Figure 4. We see there that the tergum or hostile back has passed to the interior of the sphere, whereas the spiritual face has been completely exteriorized, being directly confronted on one side with the material plane. Figure 4. The first thing that is noticed when observing Figure 4 is the disappearance of the absolute ego from its central position. The Hyperborean spirit, it is worth clarifying, is not a simple being. We must remember that we are speaking of the member of a cosmic race and not of a mere incorporeal phantasm. In addition, if it was simple, it would be useless to attempt its description, it would only be enough to designate a name. This is not possible, and that is why we have represented it as a spirit sphere, which is certainly not simple. We already know about its spherical body, the tergum horstis and the vultus spiritus. The lahasha, the spiritual face, is wisdom itself, and on it depends the absolute ego, which also the reversion has disappeared from the center. The spiritual face is not simple either, since we have supposed it to be extensive, i.e., as an interior spherical surface, but yet is homogeneous, all wisdom. Such a spiritual homogeneity is concretized in the absolute ego, which is the expression of the absolute synthesis with which the spherical spirit unifies and reunites in a single central point. Suppose that the representative surface is comprised of points that look toward the center and are synthesized there, at a single cardinal point, the absolute ego. Now, also the reversion, the Gnostic points no longer look toward the center of the sphere, interiorly, but in a completely opposite and exterior direction. What has happened to the absolute ego now? Does its disappearance signify its extinction, the breaking of the synthetic unity of wisdom? Indeed, these and other questions that could be proposed are reduced to only one: is there a point exterior to the spirit sphere that can be simultaneously seen by all the Gnostic points of the spiritual face? It is realized that this question, as well as any others similar, including the two proposed first, must be affirmatively responded to, otherwise the absolute ego would not be absolute. The character of absolute comes by being an absolute synthesis of spiritual gnosis. Its destiny, speaking in a figurative sense, is linked to the unity of the wisdom, and if that is extinguished, this also has to be extinguished, i.e., it has to die. But the spirit sphere is immortal and its ego is an absolute ego. But, if the answer must be affirmative, if indeed there is an exterior point where the absolute ego has transferred to Gnosa the reversion, it can be asked in turn, where is it? Or Bhasher said, where can there be an exterior cardinal point that simultaneously receives all the Gnostic points' gazes? In order to approximate the answer, let us consider the following. In the normal spirit sphere, Figure 2, the Gnostic points' gazes toward the absolute ego were equivalent to projections of the points of the interior spherical surface on the central point. Inversely, it could also be said that from the absolute ego, it is possible to see all the points of the spiritual face, that is, from the central point of the sphere it is possible to project a radius toward each one of the points of the interior spherical surface. Let us now consider, with this same criterion, the spirit sphere also the reversion. The point sought must be such that the projection of all the points of the sphere's exterior surface converge on it. However, it is evident at first glance that the normal projection of all the exterior points do not converge but diverge in all directions, i.e., isotropically. But we can more rigorously verify this presumption if we examine two Gnostic points, A and B, as close as one wants from the other, and measure the distance between each projective vector or look toward the absolute ego. Figure 5 Loot ego of the center, i.e., the vectors come closer together as the distance to the center is shortened. On the contrary, the gazes that proceed from the outer points, in the reverted spirit, tend to separate more and more from each other as they move away from the spherical surface. What does this tell us? To begin, that the exterior point of convergence cannot be near the spirit sphere, since the gazes, i.e., the projective vectors, are separating from each other in all directions. But how far that point may be is not so evident, since if we project all the gazes, i.e., if we consider the complete projection of the spherical surface, unlimitedly toward every direction, we will come to encompass the totality of cosmic space. Where is, then, the exterior point of convergence? Answer, in the infinite. For example, if we consider only 4 Gnostic points, 1, 2, 3, and 4, as shown in Figure 6, situated at opposite parts of the spherical surface, and we unlimitedly project them in the direction of 4 arbitrary points of reference n, s, e, and w, we can affirm that these projecting vectors will coincide at the end of their trajectory into a single common point situated in the infinite. But there is more: if, in the same way, we project all the Gnostic points, i.e., the entire spherical surface, unlimitedly toward all possible directions, they will equally end up meeting in a single common infinite point or pole. A similar point has been represented in Figure 7. To it, arrive the infinite vectors that depart from the infinite Gnostic points of the spirit sphere. In the figure, we draw only 16 of the infinite vectors. The infinite pole is, indeed, the same extreme point of each one of the vectors. Figure 6. Naturally, it is not possible to construct a schema of the spirit sphere, as in Figure 5b or 6, in which are drawn the infinite vectors in all their infinite extension, until reaching the extreme coincidence of Figure 7, nor would it be possible to only represent some of them. A single vector, the modulus or extension of which is infinite, surpasses the dimensions of any graphical schema. We can, however, agree on a reduction of the vector's dimension so that it can be represented within the framework of the schema. For this, we only have to remember that the extreme point of the vector is always the infinite pole. Figure 8. Now then, if we draw infinite vectors of, for example, 1 centimeter of a modulus, in a schema like that of Figure 4, and we mark the end of each one of them with a violet point, in representation of the infinite pole, we will see that all these points form a violet circle, exterior to the spirit sphere and at 1 centimeter apart. Figure 8 shows a similar schema, although for reasons of clarity, only 16 vectors have been drawn. In this way, the infinite pole, represented in the finitude of the graphical schema, is equivalent to an external circle to the reverted spirit sphere. It is what we call the expanded infinite pole. But let us not forget that the schema only shows one section or cross-section of the spirit sphere, in space, i.e., considering the 3 dimensions of the sphere, the infinite vectors that depart from each Gnostic point, if they also have an agreed modulus of 1 centimeter, for example, will form with their extreme points a violet sphere, exterior to the spirit sphere and 1 centimeter apart. The time has come to extract a conclusion. We now know that also the reversion, the gazes of the Gnostic points effectively converge in a single exterior point, in a way similar to what was occurring in the normal spirit when all the gazes were pointing to the central point or absolute ego. But such an exterior point is in the infinite, as we have seen. Does this signify that there the synthesis of the spiritual face is also realized and an absolute ego is formed? Yes. But this exterior ego, we are going to call it, in order to avoid confusions, infinite ego. The natural questions that arise from such a conclusion are how, if finally the spirit sphere manages to synthesize an exterior ego, does this same ego not become conscious of its reverted state, and why did we say that, after the reversion, the spirit sphere passed from being to not knowing, from orientation to disorientation, loss, and confusion? It is not difficult to give an answer to such questions, but a previous reflection is required. In truth, The reason why the infinite ego is ignorant of its situation is closely related to the reason why we have not been able to represent the infinite pole in the schema of figure 8, the relationship of immeasurability that keeps the finite with the infinite when the infinite appears as the extreme or limit of an unlimited distance. If the infinite is at the extreme of a distance, it must necessarily surpass everything that is finite, i.e., between the spirit sphere and the infinite ego, the world of finite entities must be complete. Or, in other words, the infinite ego surpasses the world of the finite entities by way of the infinite. It is as if, in figure 8, everything finite were between the green circle and the violet circle. Let us remember that in figure 2 we represent the lower material plane below the reverted spirit sphere only for reasons of expository convenience, but that in reality this plane, or world in the finite entities, surrounds the reverted spirit on all sides, and the spirit sphere is essentially opposed to that world. Absolute definition of the Hyperborean strategy now, the world of finite entities, which we recently identified with the material plane, is the world plasmated or ordered by the demiurge. Its characteristic is the archetypal order that follows Mahashur on the impulse of the temporal influence of his consciousness. It is what in Tibet they call the Great Breath but that we prefer to call time. Such an archetypal order conditions and determines every entity in its being or its coming into being, i.e., in its finitude. This is to be understood like this: a universal archetype is an idea thought by the demiurge and sustained by this one in a kind of cosmic memory, on the archetypal plane, but archetypes are not mere static images, models, molds, or paradigms, fixed in eternity, but, on the contrary, they constitute germs provided with a powerful evolutive impulse. Such an impulse comes from the breath of the demiurge and, at their own pace, said archetypal germs mature and unfold in emptying to concretize their final perfection. This perfection, which is already in a potential state since the beginning of evolutive development, is called entelchi and is, in fact, the archetype itself. The entelchi is what is folded up or potentiated in the archetype and, as a germ, what it actualizes or its unfoldment. That is why, although the entelchi is the final perfection to which evolution aims, it is also set into principle as a potency of the universal archetype, as initial perfection. Thus there is formal coincidence between the universal archetype and its entelchi. The archetypes are universal. What constitutes the individuality of any particular entity on the material plane is the actualization of monads, those that come from the first emanation of the demiurge and which are impulsed to evolve by following the order imposed, in by the planned unfolding of the universal archetypes, i.e., evolution develops according to cosmic plans, which are actually powerful archetypes called Manu. Monads are impulsed to evolve according to said plans, being totally determinate during their trajectory of descent and ascension from Mahashur or lower planes. Thus, monads can constitute a simple entity, i.e., one that expresses the evolution of a single archetype, or a composite entity, formed by the combined action of multiple archetypes. The human monad in particular, the Pusu monad, follows in its ultimate, properly human stage, the archetypal direction of a Manu archetype. However, as we will see later, certain archetypes can affect man with singular violence and even become dominant. If they are archetypes of the microcosm, i.e., of the physiological structure of the human body, they are denominated personal collective archetypes. If they are archetypes of the macrocosm, or the universe of the One, they are denominated universal collective archetypes or psychoid archetypes. But in any case, the development that these archetypes effectuate on man by emptying to concretize their entelchi is called process. The process is the act by which the archetype manifests itself to the man, emerges, and, nourishing itself with his own energy, seeks to achieve entelchi. The finitude of entities is thus determined by the entelchi of the universal archetypes, and that is why it must be understood that all finitude is a perfection since, of course, all perfection is an entelchi. The archetypal order then implies the finitude of entities, their absolute determination. But, beyond the world of finite entities is situated the infinite ego of the reverted spirit sphere. What is beyond such a world? What does the infinite signify here with regard to the finite? Imperfection and indetermination. In effect, if the finite constitutes a perfection for the archetypal order, then the infinite is the unfinished or imperfect, or, at any rate, the indeterminate. This viewed in favor of, or from, the archetypal order. For, seen from the infinite, it turns out, inversely, that the archetypal order is the illusory and non-existent, that which lacks eternity. Hence its continuous change to the rhythm of the great breath, i.e., of transcendent time. The infinite, on the other hand, is a reflection of the eternity of the spirit, that is why it spills out beyond the world of finite entities, and also beyond the transcendent temporality of the entities. Thus, we see that the act of being the infinite ego beyond the world of the finite entities implies an absolute indetermination in relation to the archetypal determination of the entities, an absolute imperfection in relation to all entelchi, and a reflection of eternity in relation to the temporal fluence of the archetypal evolution in which the entities consist. In consequence, it turns out that what for the demiurge constitutes an absolute order, is for the reverted spirit sphere an absolute disorder. But the reverted spirit sphere is essentially opposed to the material plane and, being that said plane is interposed between it and its infinite ego, will it not also be opposed to its own ego, situated beyond the material plane? Yes. And at this point we can give a response to the pending question. The reverted spirit sphere ignores its situation because between it and its infinite ego is interposed the absolute disorder of the archetypal order or material plane. The reverted spirit is essentially opposed to that order and, such an opposition, creates a barrier of incommunication with its own infinite ego that is beyond the material plane. On the other hand, the infinite ego, from the infinite, only sees the supreme illusion of the archetypal order. The one, they are denominated universal collective archetypes or psychoid archetypes. But in any case, the development that these archetypes effectuate on man by attempting to concretize their entelchi is called process. The process is the act by which the archetype manifests itself to the man, emerges, and, nourishing itself with his own energy, seeks to achieve entelchi. The finitude of entities is thus determined by the entelchi of the universal archetypes, and that is why it must be understood that all finitude is a perfection since, of course, all perfection is an entelchi. The archetypal order then implies the finitude of entities, their absolute determination. But, beyond the world of finite entities is situated the infinite ego of the reverted spirit sphere. What is beyond such a world? What does the infinite signify here with regard to the finite? Imperfection and indetermination. In effect, if the finite constitutes a perfection for the archetypal order, then the infinite is the unfinished or imperfect, or, at any rate, the indeterminate. This viewed in favor of, or from, the archetypal order. For, seen from the infinite, it turns out, inversely, that the archetypal order is the illusory and non-existent, that which lacks eternity. Hence its continuous change to the rhythm of the great breath, i.e., of transcendent time. The infinite, on the other hand, is a reflection of the eternity of the spirit, that is why it spills out beyond the world of finite entities, and also beyond the transcendent temporality of the entities. Thus, we see that the act of being the infinite ego beyond the world of the finite entities implies an absolute indetermination in relation to the archetypal determination of the entities, an absolute imperfection in relation to all entelchi, and a reflection of eternity in relation to the temporal fluence of the archetypal evolution in which the entities consist. In consequence, it turns out that what for the demiurge constitutes an absolute order, is for the reverted spirit sphere an absolute disorder. But the reverted spirit sphere is essentially opposed to the material plane and, being that said plane is interposed between it and its infinite ego, will it not also be opposed to its own ego, situated beyond the material plane? Yes. And at this point we can give a response to the pending question. The reverted spirit sphere ignores its situation because between it and its infinite ego is interposed the absolute disorder of the archetypal order or material plane. The reverted spirit is essentially opposed to that order and, such an opposition, creates a barrier of incommunication with its own infinite ego that is beyond the material plane. On the other hand, the infinite ego, from the infinite, only sees the supreme illusion of the archetypal order, alphace. Such is the drama of the reverted spirit that is denominated strategic confusion. Herein lies a fundamental concept of the Hyperborean wisdom. The state of the reverted spirit sphere is not, in effect, irreversible. It is always possible to recover the normal state of figure 2, with such objective it can be affirmed that, any way or method that makes it possible to revert the reversion of the spirit sphere, i.e., that enables it to recover its normality, is a Hyperborean strategy. Inversely, it is said that, if the reverted spirit sphere remains in ignorance of its situation, it suffers from strategic confusion. The objective of a Hyperborean strategy is, thus, the normality of the spirit. This objective supposes the search for two goals. 1. To recover the essential hostility, to make the hostile back or tergum hostis manifest against the material plane. As will be explained in another section, the manifestation of the spirit's essential hostility in the Viriya's microcosm is denominated berserker fury. 2. To achieve the reorientation of the spiritual face toward the single central point of the absolute ego. With regard to the second goal, strategic reorientation, it is worth pointing out the differences between the absolute ego and the infinite ego. The absolute ego, the ego of absolute orientation, is equivalent to a single central cardinal point, i.e., to a single direction for the gazes of the Gnostic points. The infinite ego, the ego of absolute disorientation, is equivalent to infinite cardinal points, i.e., to infinite directions for the gazes of the Gnostic points. Treason and spiritual enchainment. We have had the opportunity, so far, to study in some detail the state in which the spirit sphere was lay subsequent to the treason. We know now that, also operating on the only point of exterior awareness, a reversion of the spherical body occurred, which exteriorized the spiritual face and projected the synthetic ego into infinity. The spirit sphere then passed into a state of absolute disorientation or strategic confusion in which it is impossible for it to become aware or notice that it is lost. But the treason of the traitorous siddhas was consummated in order to serve a specific aim, the enchainment of the spirit spheres to the material plane. We return, then, to pose that question with which we present the analogical model of the spirit sphere: how is it enchained to Mahashur, to the ephemeral of life, to the variations of nature, to the cycles of life and death? How it enchained, we repeat, an eternal spirit to that illusion. Now that we know, analogically, what a spirit is, we are going to explain how it could be enchained to Mahashur. First of all, there is one question that must be previously elucidated and that can be posed this way: why did the traitorous siddhas wish to enchain the spirit spheres, members of their same race, to the universe of the One? Let us remember that in the introduction we already disclosed why the demiurge wanted the enchainment of the spirits, so that the pussy complies with the double objective of its finality, to achieve microcosmic autonomy, i.e., to reach human entelchi, and to be a giver of meaning, a producer of culture. But the traitorous siddhas, what did they intend from this? It goes without saying that such a question is extremely thorny, and that the most we can venture is the repetition of some traditional concepts of the Hyperborean wisdom. In principle, it is affirmed that the traitorous siddhas had no particular interest in causing the spirits to go astray, but that they were the means by which they used to carve out a place in the material universe of the One. Why did they have need to say Hashlu in such a nefarious place? This is a question to which it is already very difficult to respond with precision, because it questions about the spirits before the origin. As we have repeated many times, nothing can be affirmed, unless by way of supposition, about the original world of the spirit, which we describe as incognizable. For the same reason the Hyperboreans never speak of God, in the full sense, and prefer to refer to spiritual chiefs, great guides, or avatars. According to the Hyperborean wisdom, only the normal, i.e., strategically oriented spirits, have a true concept of God. For any other spiritual state out of the normality, God is incognizable, is beyond the origin, an origin that was lost through a spiritual disorientation, and that is why he is simply called the incognizable. Renouncing, then, beforehand, to inquire about the origin, the Hyperborean wisdom is more clear with regard to what happened in the beginning. The Hyperborean race entered the universe of the One, i.e., situated itself facing it, coming from the origin. No one knows why they came. Already there, a dispute arose among the chiefs. Some proposed to stay, even if it meant making an alliance with the demons. Others, instead, were urging to initiate the retreat and abandon that hell, even if it meant fighting. No agreement was reached, and finally the chiefs decided to divide into two groups. Lucifer and many chiefs who were wishing to fight and leave took the path of the lay hand. Rigton Jaepo and the rest of the traitorous Siddhas took the path of the right hand. The traitorous Siddhas allied themselves to Jehovah Satan and his demons and founded the occult hierarchy of earth. Then they constructed Chang Shambhala and definitively disrupted the evolutive plan that the breath of the solar logos was impulsing. This last infamy is represented in the occult symbol of Chang Shambhala, the Kala Chakra key. For the purpose of somehow transmuting the archetypal order, the traitors Siddhas were needing foundations of the Hyperborean wisdom to enchain the Hyperborean spirits to the evolution of an animal man called Pusu. That is the true motive for the treason, utilization. Finally, a large part of the race was enchained to pain and to the suffering of karma. Only a multitude of female spirits who could not be deceived remained free. They were the ones who called upon Lucifer so that he would come to the aid of the captive spirits. Lucifer returned to hell out of loyalty to his companions. And to save them, he delivered the Graal to the Siddhas of Agatha, in order to divinize the Hyperborean lineages and guide the Viryas toward the spirit and, from the spirit, toward the origin. The Siddhas of Agatha are known, since then, as loyal Siddhas. The Hyperborean wisdom does not tell us much more, but, in any case, we have already declared the motive of the traitorous Siddhas. They were needing to enchain the spirits in order to utilize them in the evolution of the Pusu. This motive, which we already exposed on several occasions, was going to bring into play a colossal display of infernal imagination and ingenuity and, of course, of incredible wisdom. The traitorous Siddhas, in effect, were able to comprehend the evolutive plan of the One and modify it, rivaling him in the search for the most efficient ways to concretize the absurd and vain entelechies, material regions to which the members of the Hyperborean race had descended. If the Lahasha were true, then perhaps the treason was the effect of a kind of madness previously unknown to the Hyperboreans. In any case, whatever the origin of the madness, what is certain is that passion was present from the beginning in the acts of the traitorous Siddhas. This is especially evident in the system invented, at first, to modify the Pusu race and adapt it to enchain the spirits, but which was then used whenever necessary in order to accelerate the evolution of humanity. Such a system consists in producing, with the help of a kind of advanced archetypal engineering, an entelechial human body or Manu prototype. Said bodies are animated by the same traitorous Siddhas who, thus incarnated, perform all sorts of confused deeds among common human beings. In this way, over the course of the millennia, they have systematically intervened in the differentiation and genetic selection of every human race or subrace. They have been those who forged the hybrid structure of the Virya, a genetic mixture of Pusu and divine Hyperborean, and they did it with the clear purpose of creating an adequate vehicle for the incarnation of the reverted spirits. The obvious question, undoubtedly, is, the traitorous Siddhas being members of a spiritual Hyperborean race, and having declared, as we have done, that they were creating entelechial human bodies in order to animate them and act among men, what is the true Hyperborean contribution they have introduced in the Pusu? Answer, the Minna. That is why we were saying earlier that the whole work of the traitorous Siddhas denotes a great passion. Without passion there would have been no blood memory, the Hyperborean inheritance itself. If just the genetic contribution of the Manu prototype had intervened in the mating between the extraterrestrial beings and the terrestrial Pusu, the enchainment of the spirit sphere would have been impossible. This terrible affirmation signifies that in the system invented by the traitorous Siddhas in order to enchain the spirits, passion was an essential ingredient. Passion pervades throughout the work of the traitorous Siddhas, but it is, naturally, in the sexual contact that they have assiduously made with the human race, where it manifests itself with the utmost clarity, and the proof is in the fact that today the pure type of pussy has practically disappeared. This demonstrates the great activity of the traitorous siddhas in the sphere of procreation. A great part of humanity today possesses Hyperborean lineage, i.e., blood memory, and thanks to this, the spiritual enchainment is more numerous than ever. Meant. As it is an operation of high sexual magic, its detailed description would be excessively extensive, so we will limit ourselves to summarize everything in one concept. The genetic key of the karmic system of spiritual enchainment lies in the following principle: when the Manu sexually mates with members of the human species, with the object of founding a line from which peoples or races are to descend, he secretly acts during the Maithuna by concentrating his will on plasmating, in his spouse, an image of the Hyperborean spirit's origin. In this way, the memory of the origin is constituted in the blood memory, which is an authentic perpetual inheritance from the Manu Siddha traitor, and it is plasmated in the blood, and not in any other substance, because the plasmating force used is passion in the Maithuna, or, if you will, love. The key to the system consists, then, in plasmating an image of the origin in the blood of the pussy, whereupon the Lahasha acquires a divine inheritance and becomes a Virya. We can only reiterate that such a donation does not have any good-natured characteristic but aims at the enchainment of the reverted spirits, an operation that we will see how it is concretized further ahead. It may be considered, for greater clarity, that the plasmation of the symbol of the origin is the first part of a two-stage plan, the second of which would be the enchainment itself. The creation of the Minu would thus have the sole object of facilitating, we will see how, the binding of the spirit with Mahashur. That is why the plasmated image of the origin must be intimate and secret, necessarily unconscious. Apart from the object for which it was created, the traitorous siddhas are not interested in the blood memory actually being remembered, and in the practice of their karmic system, everything is oriented in order to prevent anyone from ever accessing the image of the origin. It was precisely the offensive action of Lucifer, by depositing the Graal in the material plane, that made it possible for man to remember that he is not from here, and his lineage was henceforth divinized. Lastly, it should be noted that the white treason of the traitorous siddhas produced consequences in other worlds, of which contemporary man has not the slightest idea of their existence. In those worlds eternal spirits were also enchained, giving rise to life forms whose existence is inconceivable to the current scientific mentality. These beings, who are also Viryas, inhabit other spaces of macrocosmic signification, of which will be discussed in Article E of the Awakened Virya section. The lack of knowledge about such worlds is so great that in the development of the present book of Fundamentals of the Hyperborean Wisdom we have to refer almost exclusively to the spiritual enchainment on earth and in this historical end stage of the Kali Yuga. But we must at no time forget that such an exposition requires to be further complemented with a complete polydimensional vision of the phenomenon of the spiritual enchainment, a vision that will only be possible to experience if one accesses the Hyperborean initiation of the pure blood. Excerpt from the history of Kurt von Suberman in our novel of divulgation, The Mystery of the Hyperborean Wisdom. We allude to the mystery of the spiritual enchainment in a paragraph that is useful to remember here. In said work, in effect, the young Kurt von Suberman ends with his father, a childhood friend of Rudolf Hess, a party at the Chancellery of the Third Reich. There he is presented to the Führer, who proceeds to make surprising revelations. The complete transcript of this paragraph is given below. The end of school ceremony was being held, together with other schools, in a large festival, with multitudinous parades of the Hitler Youth, which were culminating in the Berlin Stadium. There, the top brass of the Third Reich, headed by the Führer, were establishing direct contact with the youth by means of speeches and proclamations. Papa had come from Egypt especially to witness the graduation, being invited by Rudolf Hess to a party to be held that evening at the Chancellery. It would be, in my opinion, the long-awaited opportunity to clear up many unknowns. At 10 on the dot at night we climbed the marble stairs of the Chancellery. Papa, elegantly dressed in a jacket, and I, in the uniform of the Hitlerjungen, were not out of place among the large gathering that was already filling the great hall of the Eagle, forming distinct murmuring huddles of voices and laughter. We crossed the hall in the direction of the gigantic fireplace of carved marble, looking for Rudolf Hess, while over our heads a chandelier of colossal dimensions was pouring torrents of light, sozzily dimmed by thousands of pieces of baccarat crystal. I had never seen so many distinguished and important people together. All the leaders of the new Germany were there: Dr. Goebbels, Marshal Göring, Reichsführer Himmler, Julius Streicher. In a secluded corner we distinguished a group formed by Rosenberg, Rudolf Hess, and Adolf Hitler. Papa, fearing to interrupt a private conversation, told me to wait a few steps away, while we were drinking a glass of champagne that solicitous waiters had handed us. Außer a moment, Rudolf Hess noticed us and, außer exchanging a word with the Führer, approached smiling. "How are you, Reinhold, Kurt?" he said. "Come, I will introduce you to the Führer." It was the first time that I was seeing Adolf Hitler up close, a rare honor for a foreign student, and although I was coming prepared knowing that the Führer would be at the party, it had not occurred to me that we would be introduced. "Adolf, Baron Reinhold von Suberman," said Rudolf. The Führer greeted Papa by effusively shaking his hand but without you sharing a word. "Mein Patenkind Kurt von Suberman," Rudolf continued. "Brand new graduate of Napola, pilot and polyglot soldier, future Ostenführer of the Waffen-SS. I could not help but blush at Torf-Pater's laudatory introduction. The Führer stretched out his hand, as he was fixing an icy gaze into my eyes. I felt that an electric current was running down my spinal column, while a kind of stomachic emptiness was tickling at the level of my navel. It was a sensation of an instant, but of a terrible effect. That gaze, and the contact of the Führer's hand, had worked like an acidic agent in a bucket of milk, breaking down and dissolving my state of mind. It was an instant, I repeat, a single instant in which I felt myself explored from within. Once recomposed, I observed with surprise that, something unusual for him, an enigmatic smile was appearing on the Führer's face. "From Egypt, eh?" said Hitler. "I adore Egypt, a marvelous land that fascinated Napoleon and has produced an invaluable comrade like Rudolf." Meanwhile, Rosenberg, who had already been introduced, was observing the scene with an amused expression. "When seeing you, young Kurt," Hitler continued, "I realize that it is not a coincidence about Rudolf. Egypt really is a center of spiritual force, the enigma of the Sphinx still holds true. You are the proof," he took Rudolf Hess and I by one arm each, "that a higher order guides the fate of Germany. Two German Egyptians, who have breathed the Gnostic effluvia of Alexandria and Cairo, led here by unknown superiors, to place your great spiritual capacity at the service of the National Socialist cause. Seeing you," continued the Führer, "I realize how sacred is the task that we have taken upon our shoulders, in founding the 1,000-year Reich. Our cause is not only the best ideal for which a German can live and die, it is also the cause of humanity's freedom, of the struggle to save the world from the dark forces, of the final combat against the Elementarwesen. Rosenberg and Papa were nodding their heads at each affirmation of the Führer, who was continuing to pour out mystical concepts without permitting anyone to interrupt his monologue. I distracted myself thinking about the strange power that I had experienced when greeting the Führer. A powerful force was emanating from Hitler, I did not know whether voluntarily or spontaneously, and I was wondering to myself if he had acquired this charisma by means of some secret technique, of some occult knowledge to which a privileged few can access. Then tell me, young Kurt, who are ultimately the enemies of Germany? Against whom are we fighting? Hitler was asking, addressing me. I reacted to the unexpected question, with the desperation of having ignored a part of the conversation. Three pairs of eyes, of Rosenberg, Hess, and Papa, were set on me, waiting for my answer. However, what I had managed to hear was sufficient for me, because the answer sprang by itself from the depths of my unconscious. The enemy is only one, I categorically affirmed, it is YHVH Satan. I answered intuitively and in so firm a manner that there was no room for rectifications. I looked at Papa, who instantaneously became livid, and I saw the surprise portrayed on all faces. "Very good, young Kurt, very good," Hitler was saying with an expression of intense joy. You have given the best answer. You could have identified as our most terrible enemies Judeo-Masonry, Judeo-Marxism, Zionism, etc., but those names only represent different aspects of one same reality, different faces of one same ferocious enemy, YHVH Satan, the demiurge of this world. Only an initiate or an enlightened one like you or Rudolph could give so precise a response. Right, Alfred? Rosenberg was smiling with pleasure. I congratulate you, young von Suberman, said Alfred Rosenberg, you are a person of clear concepts. Of course, I was completely stunned by what had occurred. Suddenly, in this meeting with those notable persons, I was discovering that I was possessing an inner ear, a mysterious organ that was enabling me to hear concretely formulated answers. And these answers were correct. I had never experienced anything like this and could only attribute this sudden illumination to the presence of the Führer. He, with his strange magnetism, had awakened my inner ear. Adolf Hitler returned to take the floor. People who are not attuned to the occult philosophy of National Socialism, usually commit gross errors of assessment when judging many of our affirmations, believing to see in them a stupid superficiality, when generally they are synthetic ideas, slogans, extracted from deep systems of thought. For example, before young Kurt's affirmation that the enemy is Jehovah Satan, which is a synthetic idea of deep philosophical content, many ignorant minds would be tempted to suppose that such a concept stems from a crude anti-Semitism. They would put forward elementary arguments like these: Jehovah is the God of Israel, a God of race, one among hundreds of ethnic gods. It is then exaggerated to take him for the only God or demiurge. Or this other one, Jehovah is the God of Israel but, because of his monotheistic character, he is the only God. Then why identify him with the demiurge? Is it because of a heretical belief of the Gnostic type? Another banal argument is the following: if we are to reject the demiurge considering his material work as essentially evil, why only identify him with the Jewish Jehovah, having hundreds of alternative denominations in ethnological mythology and in the religious pantheons of all the peoples of the earth? When hearing of Jehovah Satan as the enemy against whom we fight, our critics would raise objections like the preceding, and, of course, the word Satan to Jehovah would surprise them, which would undoubtedly draw ironic conclusions from them. Well, such arguments rest on a common circumstance, the ignorance of those who formulate them. Of course, we know that the demiurge received other names throughout history. But if we choose, among them, that of Jehovah, it is because it is the most recent name by which he has called himself. And with said name his chosen people, Israel, which are nothing more than a psychic unfolding of the same Jehovah Satan, still designate him. These words of the Führer vividly surprised me by their metaphysical implications. Do the Jews not constitute a race like the others, comprised of individuals? It was a disturbing theory that I had just heard. Are you surprised, young Kurt? Asked the Führer, who no doubt immediately noticed my disturbance. But he did not give me time to respond and continued his explanation. Well, you haven't heard anything yet. Israel is a chakra of the earth, that is to say, it is a collective psychic manifestation of the demiurge Jehovah, and that is why we affirm that the Jew does not exist as an individual, that he is not a man like the rest of those who compose humankind. But the manifestation of Jehovah in a chosen race is a more or less recent event, of a few thousand years, and the ordering of matter or creation dates from millions of years ago. That is why, because of the novelty that the name Jehovah represents compared with other names of the demiurge, which more ancient and culturally more important peoples were using in history, and because of the geological antiquity of the universe, urge to which we can comfortably denominate the One, just as the Stoics did. This is who orders chaos and pantheistically diffuses himself throughout the universe. But the cosmic plan, it is necessary to somehow name the idea of the material universe, is based on the dream of the demiurge, a state of quietude that nevertheless dynamizes the cosmos, like the unmoved mover of Aristotle in that great day of manifestation, which is also called Mahamanvantara. But so that everything functions without requiring the intervention of the One, who sleeps while everything lives in him, it is necessary to have an automatic correction system. This is the role fulfilled by the so-called cosmic hierarchies, myriads of conscious entities emanated by the One to maintain the impulse given to the universe and to carry forward its plan. The first step of the emanation are the monads, hierarchetypes that fundament the whole cosmic structure and serve as the matrix of the One's plan. These conscious entities, angels, devas, solar logos, galactic logos, planetary souls, etc., are not individual beings but form part of the same One and possess, then, the mere appearance of existing due to the degrees of freedom with which they are endowed during the manvantara. In order for something to individually exist, an entity for example, it is necessary to suppose the act of existing to its real being, which also supposes the subsistence of the entity, which prevents the communication of its substantial essence with other entities or its metaphysical participation with other beings, that is to say, it puts a formal end to the entity or grants it its natural form. The recourse to achieve said illusion of existence is the extreme mechanicity of the material reality founded on the evolutive laws, both referred to continuous and discrete phenomena, which maintain the progressive movement of Mahashur and energy in the exact attainment of the One's plan. Said evolutive laws are preserved by the conscious entities, already mentioned, and directed in the direction of the plan. Thus we can distinguish, for example, solar logos, that is to say, conscious entities capable of creating a solar system following the plan of the One, but that in reality are temporary unfoldments of the One. The same can be said of the galactic logos or planetary souls and even of the simple angels or devas. None of them exist as such, although they evolve subject to universal laws. The important thing here is to comprehend that this whole grandiose spectacle that we are recreating is pure illusion, a metapsychic conception of colossal characteristics devised by the One for his intimate contemplation. Because the truth is that all that exists disappears in the end, when the great pralaya comes, the night of Brahma, in which everything is once again confused in him, osira monstres phagocytation. But we said that the universe is ruled by evolutive laws. Said laws, which determine the material universe, according to a true heavenly architecture, as the satanic Masons say, occasion the existence of the different planes of space or heavens in which reality is constituted. Just as there are various heavens, there are kingdoms of nature or planets or root races, etc. These deceptive aspects form part of the plan of the One, and the demons in charge of carrying forward said plan form a precise hierarchical order, based on the famous law of evolution that rules the heavens, all the heavens, from the atomic, chemical, or biological to the cosmic, in which each monad evolves following the archetypes of each heaven. It is the famous law of cause and effect that the Sinaki teaches and that the Vedic religions of India call karma and dharma, but that is convenient to synthesize as law of evolution. This law directs the round-trip path of the monad, which takes various bodies in the different heavens to which it descends to evolve. Said path is usually represented as the serpent that bites its own tail or Ouroboros. Of course, the famous monadic individuation is never reached, for that would be an authentic mutilation of the substance of the One, and before such a thing happens, the whole universe will already be phagocytized in his holy belly. Here, strangely, the Führer smiled as he was looking at me intensely. I was inwardly struggling with conflicting sentiments. On the one hand, I was horrified by the theory that I was hearing, already familiar from having studied it in the Napola, but now endowed with an impressive meaning of reality when being vehemently expounded with the Führer's irresistible eloquence. And on the other hand, I was feeling flabbergasted by the honor of receiving from the lips of the Führer of Germany, a personal, terribly extensive, and curiously out-of-place explanation at a mundane party at the Chancellery. In any case, my exterior attitude was of respectful attention to each one of his words, for I was not wanting to distract myself again. I suppose that you already know this theosophical theory that the Sinaki teaches in its Masonic or Rosicrucian sects, and that you must feel frightened before a deterministic conception in which there is no foreseen place for eternal individual existence, that is to say, beyond the pralayas and manvantaras. And precisely that fright, that cry of rebellion that you must perceive welling up from your pure blood, constitutes an exception to all the rules of the deterministic mechanics of the One, because it speaks of another reality alien to his material universe. How can that be if we have said that everything that exists in the cosmos has been thought and made by him, according to his plan and through the intermediary of his cosmic and planetary hierarchies? Well, young Kurt, I will tell you briefly, because a part of humanity, which we integrate, possesses an element that does not belong to the material order and that cannot be determined by the demiurge's law of evolution. That element, which is called spirit or vril, is present in some men as a possibility of eternity. We know of it through the blood memory, but as long as we are not capable of freeing ourselves from the ties that bind us to the illusory reality of the demiurge and retracing the path back to the origin, we will not really exist as eternal individuals. You will ask me how it is that in a closed order like that which I have described, spiritual elements foreign to it can coexist, and why, if they cannot be determined by the laws of Mahashur and energy, they remain subject to the universe of the One. This is a great mystery. But you can consider as a hypothesis that, for a reason that we do not know but that we can suppose to be an order from a being infinitely superior to the demiurge, or an incomprehensible negligence, or a colossal deception, once a myriad of beings belonging to a spiritual race, that we call Hyperborean, entered the material universe. Let us suppose that such beings had penetrated the solar system through a gate opened on another planet, for example Venus, and that here, thanks to a ruse, a part of their Hyperborean guides had enchained them to the law of evolution. This enchainment, we have already said, cannot be real but, nevertheless, the traitorous guides manage to confuse the eternal spirits by anchoring them to Mahashur. Why do they do this? Another mystery. But what is certain, what is true, is that, from the arrival of such guides to the solar system, a collective mutation will take place throughout the galaxy that modifies the plan of the One. This modification is built on the treason of the guides and on the fall of the immortal beings. In order so that you see it clear, young Kurt, I will tell you that here, on Earth, there was a primitive human being who was evolving following the laws of the planetary chains and the kingdoms of nature. This evolution was very slow and was pursuing the final adaptation to an absolutely animal racial archetype, endowed with a rational mind, logically structured by cerebral functions and possessing a soul made up of energy from the other, more subtle, material planes. This man is that whom the traitorous guides found, at a still primitive stage of their development, when arriving on Earth millions of years ago. Then, by means of an ingenious system called Chang Shambhala, which you will have the opportunity of studying in our order, they decided to mutate the human race, enchaining the eternal spirits to the illusory and material human beings of the earth. From that moment on there are three classes of men: the primitive animal men or Pasus, the semi-divines or Viryas, to whom a spirit was shaped, and the divine Hyperboreans or Siddhas, who are all those who manage to return to the origin and escape from the great deception. A part of the guides are also called Hyperborean Siddhas, those who did not betray and who, headed by Christos Lucifer, attempt to save the Viryas through the Hyperborean redemption of the pure blood, which consists in awakening the primordial memory of one's own lost divinity. These are the lords of Agatha, but we deviate a little from our main theme that was about Jehovah Satan, the enemy against whom we combat to win the right to return to the lost origin. Then this question will become clear to you, young Kurt, for if you recall that the One was delegating to some conscious entities the execution of his plan, we can now add that the solar system has been constructed by one such consciousness to which we call solar logos, seconded by devas of lesser hierarchy who occupy determinate positions in the mechanics of the system. On Earth, a planetary entity was infusing life into the planet and impulsing the evolution of the kingdoms of nature according to the solar plan, inserted into the cosmic plan of the One. It is clear that these are hierarchically linked emanations of the One galactic logos, solar logos, planetary angel, collective or group soul, etc. Who is God here? Depending on the level of consciousness and the cultural and religious norms of men, it can be any of such conscious entities, but it is always the One. If one says that God is the Son or conceives a creator God of the whole universe, the One is being spoken of. It is the same if one believes that God is nature or the Milky Way or the Earth. The different gnosiological cosmologies that men present in their different stages of evolution in order to conceive the world, do not invalidate the fact that one always alludes directly or indirectly to the One when God is spoken of. But let us return to Earth. When the traitorous guides arrive on Earth, they establish themselves in a center to which they call Shambhala, or Dejung, and found what has come to be known as the Great White Brotherhood or occult hierarchy of Earth. It is not a physically locatable place on the terrestrial surface, a Mahashur about which you will have to learn more later, but is situated in a topological fold of space. But what is of interest here is to point out that the chief of the traitorous guides titles himself King of the World, going on to occupy the place of one of the 12 Kumaras of the solar system. What is a Kumara? A planetary angel, one of those conscious entities enchained by the One that make up the idea of a planet. It is here where the key to the name Jehovah and his chosen race is to be found. Because the planetary spirit was called Kumara Sanat, who also the constitution of Shambhala and the coming of the King of the World, decides to act as regent of the One in the execution of his plan, now modified. For it he incarnates, in the name of the One, in a chosen race to reign over the enslaved Hyperborean spirits. That is the Hebrew race. That is to say that we have on the one side the occult hierarchy of Chang Shambhala, with its demons, the traitorous guides and their chief, the King of the World, who now carry forward the evolution of the planet and are those who guide the races by means of a sinister organization called Synaky. And on the other we have the Hebrew race, which is nothing but the modification of Sanat Kumara on Earth in order to occupy the highest echelon of the Synaky, in the name of the One. The Hebrews themselves in their Kabbalah study that Israel is one of the 10 Sephiroth, the Sephirah Malkith, which is to say one of the emanations of the One. Finally, Jehovah is the Kabbalistic name of the one demiurge that Sanat Kumara represents on Earth and is, as I said at the beginning of this pleasant chat, the most recent historical name that we know of him. That is why we, the ancient Hyperborean beings who still remain enchained in hell, must keep in mind that the enemy is Jehovah Satan, the demiurge of this world, as the young Kurt said well. The Führer was enthusiastically continuing his long monologue and, although a long hour had already passed and the curious glances of many people who were wishing to be seated at the table were raining down upon us, no one in Germany would have been capable of interrupting him for so prosaic a reason as having dinner. I, for my part, was only wishing to continue listening to his incredible revelations, and that is why, when he asked me if I had understood him, I did not hesitate to let him know my doubts. There is something that now worries me, I said immediately. All that you have said, mein Führer, about the one demiurge, I perfectly comprehend and accept, but I cannot help but then wonder who God is, the true God, or ... That is a question that you must not ask yourself, young Kurt, the Führer categorically affirmed. Not while your mind is subject to rational logic, for then you will only arrive at irreducible paradoxes. But it is evident that doubt has already germinated in you and that you will continue meditating on it. I will then give you a provisional answer. God is incognizable for anyone who has not conquered the vril. Always bear this truth in mind, young Kurt. From the miserable condition of a slave of Jehovah Satan it is not possible to know God, for he is absolutely transcendent. It is necessary to go a long way of blood purification to know something about God, about the true God, as you rightly say. In them synarchic ideas in the genetic memory of their members, in order to be able to direct them toward the great collective archetype called Manu. Thus, perceiving reality behind a veil of deception, one arrives at these conceptions of a pantheistic, monistic, or trinitarian God, which are only appearances of the One, the ordering demiurge of Mahashur. Note what occurs with the concept of God that the different peoples of the ancient family of Indo-Germanic languages possess. Almost all the names derive from the same words, and it is certain that these, in the remote past, denote a God, creator of all that exists. That is to say, the demiurge, the One. In Sanskrit we have the words Dyaus Pitta, which in the Vedas are used to name the Father which art in heaven. Dyaus is the root that in Greek produces Zeus and Theo, with a meaning similar to Sanskrit and that becomes Jupiter, Deus Pater, or Jovis in Latin. The ancient Germanics were likewise referring to Zo, Tyr, or Tiwaz as the creator god of existence, words that also come from the Sanskrit Diyaus Pitta. Words that designate God in the Turanian and Semitic language families possess the same etymology. In this last family, of important relationship with Hebrew, we find El as an ancient denomination of the demiurge in his planetary representative, the strong. In Babylonia, Phoenicia, and Palestine were worshipped El, El, Enlil, names that the Arabs transformed into Ilah or Allah, etc. This etymological unity should not surprise you, young Kurt, for what is alarming is the unity of concept that is discovered behind the mentioned words, since in all religions and philosophies one always arrives at two or three apparently irreducible ideas of God, but that in reality refer to different aspects of the demiurge, such is the preference for a pantheistic and immanent God, the one, or transcendent but creator of the earth and the heavens, Jehovah Satan, Jupiter, Zeus, Brahma, etc. The Führer was now looking at me with shining eyes and I guessed that his next words would have truly important content. There was a war, young Kurt. A dreadful war, of which the Mahabharata perhaps retains a distorted memory. That war involved various heavens in its theatre of operations and produced as its most external expression, what has come to be called the sinking of Atlantis. But no one knows in depth what is referred to when Atlantis is spoken of, since it is not only a mahashar of a sunken continent. Said war has already been going on for more than 1,000,000 years on this physical plane, during which several physical, continental Atlantises have sunk, and now, in our 20th century, we can say that Atlantis is ready to sink again. But let us leave this mystery for now, for you will have to return to it during your studies. To conclude this conversation I will tell you one last thing, young Kurt. You should know that in that essential war, in which one fights for the liberation of the captive spirits, for the collective mutation of the race, against the Synachi and against Jehovah Satan, the Third Reich has commi-ed all its spiritual, biological, and material potential. With these terrible words, the Führer seemed to end his explanation. I looked around me and saw that Papa, Rosenberg, and Rudolf Hess were still at my side. An elegant waiter indicated to the Führer that when they were ready they could go into the inner courtyard for a cold supper. It was 11 at night. The Führer and Rosenberg bade us farewell and went to join Göring and Dr. Goebbels at the head of the table. Rudolf Hess invited Papa and I to join him for dinner, but I had not come out well of the conversation with the Führer and, at the risk of being offensive, I decided to speak frankly with both of them. The one scheme of the universe. In this first part we propose to explain why the genetic key, specifically, allows the enchainment of the spirit in the Pasu. But, to understand this, it is necessary to previously investigate the psychic nature of the Pasu, thus we arrive at one of the objectives that we had set at the beginning. We will now study the primitive psychic constitution of the Pasu, but we will do so in relation to the archetypal order of which it is a tributary. It is therefore necessary to determine the frame of reference of said archetypal order, and this cannot be done in a harsher way than by describing, with the same analogical system used up to this point, the basic structure of the universe of the one, i.e., of the world that the spirits found when piercing the origin. The analogical scheme of such a structure can be seen in Figure 9. The central material plane area represents the concrete part of the cosmic plan. It can be said that the direction of evolution is directed there. The mahashar of this plane is that which is capable of fulfilling every possible form in such a way that, in the whole of entities, the grossest mahashar of solids must appear at one extreme and at the other the subtlest forms of psychic energy, passing through all intermediate densities, including the etheric or devic planes of elemental life. Thus, it is to be understood that the center, or the central region of said area, is the zone of Mahashia's greatest density, which become lighter and lighter toward the limiting circumference. This circumference, signaled in the scheme as archetypal plane, corresponds to what we have sometimes called the universal collective unconscious, but which in India and Tibet, in the science of the Great Breath, they usually call Parabrahmic Akasha, and to which they attribute to be the deposit of the ideas or archetypes of the divine mind. In effect, the will of the demiurge manifests through the archetypal plane, i.e., flows the transcendent time that is his consciousness, or as they would say in India, the breath of Parabrahman impulse is the manifestation of the potential forms of the Akasha. The fluence of time, from the archetypal plane, toward Mahashur, is the plasmating and ordering act by which every entity exists and by which every entity tends toward some entelecheial perfection. The material plane is thus a world of ebullient dynamism in which there is no place for quietude except in a referential sense, stopped in relation to something mobile. Such a world is purely phenomenal, subject to temporal processes, whether continuous or discrete, which surpass, in every case, the capacity of human apprehension based on a triple partition of time, past, present, and future. The apprehension of a phenomenon in the present moment of knowing implies having surprised it in a phase of its process, having grasped only a fleeting. The one scheme of the universe. In this first part we propose to explain why the genetic key, specifically, allows the enchainment of the spirit in the Pasu. But, to understand this, it is necessary to previously investigate the psychic nature of the Pasu. Thus we arrive at one of the objectives that we had set at the beginning. We will now study the primitive psychic constitution of the Pasu, but we will do so in relation to the archetypal order of which it is a tributary. It is therefore necessary to determine the frame of reference of said archetypal order, and this cannot be done in a harsher way than by describing, with the same analogical system used up to this point, the basic structure of the universe of the one, i.e., of the world that the spirits found when piercing the origin. The analogical scheme of such a structure can be seen in Figure 9. The central material plane area represents the concrete part of the cosmic plan. It can be said that the direction of evolution is directed there. The Mahashur of this plane is that which is capable of fulfilling every possible form in such a way that, in the whole of entities, the grossest Mahashur of solids must appear at one extreme and at the other the subtlest forms of psychic energy, passing through all intermediate densities, including the etheric or devic planes of elemental life. Thus, it is to be understood that the center, or the central region of said area, is the zone of Mahashur's greatest density, which become lighter and lighter toward the limiting circumference. This circumference, signaled in the scheme as archetypal plane, corresponds to what we have sometimes called the universal collective unconscious, but which in India and Tibet, in the science of the Great Breath, they usually call Parabrahmic Akasha, and to which they attribute to be the deposit of the ideas or archetypes of the divine mind. In effect, the will of the demiurge manifests through the archetypal plane, i.e., flows the transcendent time that is his consciousness, or as they would say in India, the breath of Parabrahman impulse is the manifestation of the potential forms of the Akasha. The fluence of time, from the archetypal plane, toward Mahashur, is the plasmating and ordering act by which every entity exists and by which every entity tends toward some entelecheial perfection. The material plane is thus a world of ebullient dynamism in which there is no place for quietude except in a referential sense, stopped in relation to something mobile. Such a world is purely phenomenal, subject to temporal processes, whether continuous or discrete, which surpass, in every case, the capacity of human apprehension based on a triple partition of time, past, present, and future. The apprehension of a phenomenon in the present moment of knowing implies having surprised it in a phase of its process, having grasped only a fleeting figure in appearance, having perceived an image of a possible series, having known, in short, only an aspect of its truth. Such a world, then, in the face of the human sensorial impotence for apprehending the phenomenon in its process, seems to have been specially projected in order to produce illusions and insurmountable appearances. The archetypal plane is, as the analogical schema shows, that part of the demiurge that borders the material plane on all sides, contains it, and determines its phenomena. If one considers, as is classical, a triple composition of the demiurge, power, beauty, and three wisdom, it can be affirmed that the wisdom aspect corresponds directly to the archetypal plane, where the divine plans exist, i.e., the universal archetypes and manas, that the breath, or transcendent flow of his time consciousness, exerts its power on the material plane, and that the beauty aspect consists of the potential integrity of all archetypal entelechies. Alice Bailey and other theosophists also equate the Judeo-Christ three, but, as we said, the demiurge is also spirit. And an infinite spirit, a quality that can be appreciated, in Figure 9, in the exterior circumference of the negative or potential infinite. The potential or negative character of the demiurgic infinite comes from it being totally alien to the material plane. The infinite, in effect, cannot penetrate into a structure archetypically determinate and evolutively oriented toward entelechial finalities. Nevertheless, the infinite is always present in the nature of the demiurge, and he reserves for himself, so to speak, the possibility of employing its potentiality if necessary or if he deems it convenient. But the important thing is that, apart from this exterior potential infinite on the material plane, there is no archetype of the infinite on the archetypal plane. It is obvious, if there were, then the infinite would effectively intervene, interfering in the development of all processes, i.e., continuity could not occur, since the infinite would decompose all actual movement into infinite parts. This being so, how, then, has man come to possess the notion and concept of the infinite, being clear that this was a knowledge denied, and at the same time forbidden, to all reason founded on the archetypal and phenomenonic order of the material plane? It is evident that such a concept must have a non-rational and, of course, non-mathematical origin. Further ahead we will see this capital question answered. Now let us answer another previous question, about the psychic structure of the Pasu, since we have already described the frame of reference of the archetypal order or material plane in which the Lahashur unfolds. It has been affirmed ad nauseam that man is the synthesis of creation, a supreme analogy of the cosmic totality, a microcosm that reproduces the macrocosm, etc. It has also been said that such a synthesis is never complete because of the simultaneous evolution in which both man and universe, both microcosm and macrocosm, develop. But notwithstanding this lack of completion that characterizes man, it is agreed that his presence on Earth demonstrates the culmination of a phylogenetic evolutive process that begins in the most primitive and ancient forms of life. However, the Hyperborean Wisdom, by confirming various esoteric traditions, goes further by assuring that the evolutive process that leads to man has not only developed in the animal kingdom but also includes the vegetable and mineral kingdoms, and has even taken place in other regions outside of Earth. On the archetypal plane there are human monads that, impulsed to manifest themselves in Mahashur by the breath of the demiurge, project their essence onto the lower planes or heavens of which the material plane is comprised. This actualization of the monadic potency, which descends to regions of different material density, produces the animation of an infinity of other archetypal forms, which it assimilates and synthesizes until culminating in the animal kingdom and in man. The man that we are considering is the animal man or Pasu. It is evident, for the reasons given, that there is a very close relationship, a causal link, between the finality of the world and the finality of the Pasu, i.e., between the destiny of the world and the destiny of the animal man. The archetypal synthesis in which man is constituted is not a mere replica of the macrocosm, a meaningless copy. On the contrary, all the meaning of the cosmos rests in man. All that there is in the world, is for man. In the following sections we will refer to the macrocosmic objective of the finality, to place meaning on the entities and with it to produce culture, without any clarification. In the section Function of the Conscious Sphere, the microcosmic objective will be studied in detail, to construct the conscious sphere. The finality of the world is to serve as the framework for man's development, its synthesis. The finality of man is to place meaning on the world, his matrix. Such is the motive of the demiurge. In view of this, it is common to ask, what end does this motivation pursue? What hidden purpose underlies the decision to create the universe and, within it, man? The answer, even if it causes surprise, is neither more nor less than the finality declared earlier, to place meaning on the world. Naturally, if this is the only object of motivation, it will be necessary to clarify, to shed more light on the matter. This is what we will do, also the following warning. The false inferiority of man against the universe. Here we will warn about a cultural prejudice solidly established in our epoch, the formulation of which has all the appearance of being fundamented on science, but which in truth is rooted in naive realism, rationalism, and fear. We refer to the objection that is usually made, against any attempt to teleologically link man and the universe, that the universe is too large compared to the smallness of man, a man reduced to the terrestrial sphere, i.e., to one planet among several in the solar system, one solar system among millions that make up the Milky Way galaxy, one galaxy among billions that populate the universe, an immeasurable universe, which expands and equilibrates, perhaps, facing other universes of anti-Mahashur. Faced with such a theoretical macrovision, the simple man stops in bewilderment and, subsequently, adopts the classic attitudes of those who find themselves under the pressure of a myth. Humiliation, submission, devotion, resignation, etc. The most common form of this myth is the enormous universe versus human insignificance opposition, a myth that Galileo's telescope, radio telescopes, rocket propellant, artificial satellites, computerized physico-mathematical stellar models, etc., have helped to update, but which is still a myth, since man, 99.9% of humanity, is not in a very different situation with regard to the universe today than the inhabitants of ancient Rome, Greece, Egypt, or Babylon. The reality of man is, today more than ever, circumscribed to the structure of the solar system and, fundamentally, of the Earth, of which, it is good to remember, no one enters or leaves except at birth or death. This is the concrete reality of billions of men, and all the rest is scientific theory elaborated by urban elites, by beings uprooted from nature who float in the sea of nominalism, in a world of jargons and vain signs. The habitual gnoseological Daltonism of the Western scientist is, in the case of cosmic evaluation, simple myopia, in spite of the extension of the sensorial spectrum that instrumentation supposes, because nothing can be known outside that has not been previously known inside. Man's natural sensorial information was already insufficient and equivocal for apprehending a phenomenon, but to intercalate between the unknown phenomenon and the senses a known phenomenon, which is an instrument, and to claim that true knowledge can be ashamed from this triple implication is pure folly. What is ashamed are scientific theories, i.e., a kind of poison, the toxicity of which increases in direct proportion to the structural complexity of the factual object that it attempts to explain. Of course, when the object of the theory is the universe, the size of the theory, and its toxicity, is tremendously large. Godlike. Let it not be said that we exaggerate. Go to any quiet valley, or to a country village, or even to the suburbs of some modern city, i.e., to the places where the majority of the world's people inhabit, who have never seen, nor will ever see, in the sky anything but bright spots, and listen to these persons talk about Saturn's rings or black holes, hear them say that the universe is expanding, affirming that all this is true, that they know it because it is scientific and because everybody knows it. Hear these things with patience and then dedicate yourself to observe the filth, the misery, the hunger, the vice, or any other scourge that surrounds and covers these people but which they do not see, although they believe to know that a black hole is, and then reflect whether these good people have not been intoxicated with cultural poison, whether they have not been inoculated in their minds with noxious and paralyzing elements. Only in a tenebrous historical framework like the Kali Yuga, and under the corrupting impulse of the Synarchy, could there be such a nihilistic human type, who finds certainty in concepts as improbable as they are absurd and the contents of which allude to realities unusually distant from his daily life, which he denies with his attitude and from which, undoubtedly, he pretends to flee. That is why whoever supposes that the universe is too large a construction, in which man cannot have any importance, is obliged to previously detoxify himself, otherwise he will not be able to comprehend what we explain here. The Hyperborean Wisdom assures us, against all contrary cultural affirmations, that the Demiurge created the universe with an anthropocentric criterion and that man, not only the terrestrial but any class of animal man, is fundamental because he grants meaning to his creation. Having made this warning, let us explain this finality that the animal man or Pasu must fulfill within the universe. Finality and suprafinality. We have mentioned three aspects of the demiurge: power, wisdom, and beauty. Let us now interpret more deeply the fact of the archetypal plasmation. In principle, the demiurge thinks the universal archetypes with the wisdom aspect and thinks them, then, with a view to the integrity of an evolutive plan. The archetypes are thus born with a pre-established finality, apart from their own particular entelecheial finalities, which comprises them all in the structure of the plan. Such a suprafinality is that of the universe itself, i.e., it is creation's sole motive. But, on the material plane, the archetype's sphere of action, phenomena have an entropic character, i.e., they inevitably conclude in the direction of time. At the end of a great time everything will have returned to the initial nothingness, the material order will have been dissolved, and the end will be equal to the beginning. This entropic end of the material universe cannot be the suprafinality that motivated its creation. That is why many have rightly intuited that the demiurge created the universe for his contemplation, that the manifestation of the archetypal forms to the rhythm of the fluence of transcendent time constitutes a grandiose spectacle with which he regales himself. However, although partly correct, this concept sins of Aristotelian naivete, for it supposes the demiurge to be an unmoved mover, i.e., who moves without moving, and who, from his unmovedness or eternal quietude, derives pleasure from the contemplation of his work. This is like attributing to the demiurge the practice of solitary vice, a kind of cosmic onanism. If we accept the Hermetic principle that the aspects of the demiurge are reflected in man, we can understand the la by observing the analogous behavioral patterns of the former. Since it is a question of understanding the creative motivation of the demiurge, it will be necessary to observe the creative type of man. And in this examination we find that there is no motivation like the ecstatic contemplation that an aspect of the demiurge is supposed to have taken on. In reality no one, much less the demiurge, dwells too long on the contemplation of his own work. The painter, in painting new pictures, forgets the old ones, the poet gives away his poems, the writer sells his books, etc. We wish to show with these examples how unnatural, how unusual, it would be for the painter to remain always contemplating a single picture painted by him, or for the writer to read always and only his own book. We us only an initial pleasure, and it is no objection to suppose that a continuous creation must provide a perpetual pleasure. The inventor, even when he knows that he continues to perfect himself, soon gives up his invention and occupies his attention with other things that offer him new satisfactions. The anticipated knowledge of the finality is what, in the long run, takes away the attraction of an extremely prolonged project. The pleasure does not increase but, on the contrary, diminishes as the project is concretized. The maximum pleasure is obtained at the moment of the conception of the project. The different steps of the work and its concretion only confirm that initial pleasure but cannot increase it. And the demiurge already experienced such a maximum pleasure when he conceived the evolutive plan and thought the universal archetypes, from their wisdom and beauty aspects. When, subsequently, the demiurge emanates the monads that give reality to the archetypes and impulses them to unfold in matter, with the breath that proceeds from his willpower aspect, the suprafinality that motivates such an action must be other than the experience of ecstatic or contemplative pleasure. The demiurge has not set in motion the mechanism of creation and then disengaged himself from it, since every entity of the material plane is temporal, i.e., it exists in his consciousness, it is sustained, as a phenomenon, by the transcendent fluence of his breath. But this participation does not signify a finality in itself, it is only the execution of the suprafinality. In order to find out, or at least to intuit, what this suprafinality consists in, let us once again observe creative men. Once the work has been conceived and executed, i.e., once the pleasure of its creation has been obtained, in what way can the work provide a new pleasure? Answer, by its post-discovery. To prove it, it is enough to think of the painting that painter executed years ago. The finality of its conception was concretized when he finished painting it and the creative pleasure culminated with it, but not so the suprafinality of receiving new pleasure by the post-discovery that the public constantly makes of it. Indeed, there is nothing that delights an author, apart from the pleasure that performing the work provided to him, more than being flash-carried by the public. In each admirer there is a new discovery of his work, and in each discovery a new meaning. That is, the public is who actually grants meaning to the work, who values and valorizes it. The discovery, under a particular optic, signifies a special meaning, a different interpretation that, because of this, does not leave space for indifference. One can admire or despise, love or hate, but never remain indifferent once the work has been discovered. And this discovery implies, sooner or later, the discovery of the author, the transference of the impression caused by the work to the author. We can now understand the suprafinality of creation. The work of the demiurge requires a post-discovery. And that is the finality of the animal man or Pasu, to be a discoverer of entities, a giver of meaning. But what is it that is covered in the entities, that which the Pasu must discover in order to fulfill his destiny? Answer: the names, the words that the acoustic Kabbalah mentions, or the Behos of the Indo-Aryan tradition. But this answer requires further clarification. First of all, in order to comprehend what we refer to by the name of the entities, we must remember that the evolutive impulse of the monads has been affirmed with the logos aspect of the demiurge. This signifies that each entity is designated from the beginning by the verb of the demiurge, that each entity has been assigned a word that metaphysically identifies it, sustains it as an entity, and constitutes the true essence of the entity for the Pasu. Secondly, we must again distinguish, when considering the archetypal order, between finality and suprafinality. By finality we allude to the entelligical concretion toward which the evolution of entities points. In every entity there is a universal terminus that is an expression of the archetypes that sustain it and to which process it is subordinated. By suprafinality we refer, on the other hand, to the particular design that each entity possesses insofar as it is made up of monads. It is not that the monads are in the entity, but that the archetypal order in which all Mahashur participates is structured on the basis of the actualization of the monads. An archetypal quantum of energy or archetypal atom, of which Bohr's atom is only a superficial schema, corresponds to each monad on the material plane. In reality, the universal archetypes themselves are made up of monads, which is why they are also called archetypal, since they come from the demiurge's first emanation, while the archetypes are ideas thought about the monads, in the second emanation. The universal archetypes are thus forms that go from the simple to the complex, made up from groupings of the absolute formative unity that is the archetypal monad. It is not true, then, that universal archetypes are all perfect and simple ideas, but, on the contrary, they have been structurally formed by a successive and orderly imitation of the archetypal monad. It can be said that the whole universe has been constructed from a primary monad tirelessly imitated by the demiurge. That is why the essential characteristic of the demiurge is imitation. Summarizing, we have archetypal monads and, conformed by them, universal archetypes. These beings, of course, belong to the archetypal plane, which constitutes the only object of knowledge, the only true source, of all metaphysics. This archetypal plane or metaphysical heaven acts upon lower Mahashur by imprinting a dynamic order on it at the rhythm of the fluence of the breath, or time. The material plane is the expression of such an archetypal order. On the material plane the archetypal monads manifest themselves as archetypal atoms or archetypal quanta of energy, i.e., as the existent essence of all substance. The universal archetypes, for their part, manifest themselves on the material plane as the formal support in the entities, which are the concrete expression of a moment of the evolutive process in which they develop. There is thus a double archetypal determination of the entities, the universal of the archetypes and the particular of the monads. The projection of the great archetypal plans or Manu archetypes on the original formless Mahashur produces the universal entity and the particular entities fundamentally structured with archetypal atoms. The entity evolves, then, by following two formative processes: 1, the universal, which aims toward the entelchy of the archetypes; 2, the particular, which determines the entity according to a plan. Hence the necessity of correctly distinguishing what has been placed in the entities, from the beginning, for the knowledge of the Pasu and what corresponds to the entity itself as the fundament of its universal existence, until the end, whether or not the Pasu is in the world. We can affirm, as an answer to the question, that the Pasu was given, from the beginning, the possibility of knowing the plans starting from the discovery of the entities, from the design that they express for him. The destiny of the Pasu, as a discoverer and admirer of the Demiurge's work, is, to know the entities, from the entities, to know the structure of the universal entity, of the universe, from the universal entity, to know God. On the contrary, in this sinister plan, no way of knowing the entity's archetypal essence is provided. Further ahead it will become clear why. Systematic eccentric circles are purpose is to show the psychic structure of the Pasu at the moment prior to the enchainment of the reverted spirit spheres. In order to facilitate such an exposition, nothing seems more useful than to represent the psychic structure, broken down into its different spheres of objectivity, by means of an equivalent graphical schema, such as we have done up to now. However, such a representation, and subsequently another for the psychic structure of the lost Virya, will require a greater symbolic precision. Strictly speaking, the schemata presented so far were founded on the notion of the unit circle, the circumference as a symbolic contents limit or containing form, the same for the case of the concentric circles of Figure 9. The world of objects, such as it appears to our vision, offers itself to a simple circular formalization, but the formal relationships of a world of substances and qualities require a more complex structure than that of a unit circle. Figure 10. The author of this paragraph, the epistemologist Luciano Allende Sama, has demonstrated in his book The Elements that a systematization of eccentric circles is appropriate and correct for relating, in an ordinal and cardinal form, concepts, i.e., qualitative and quantitative abstractions. If eccentric circles support simple concepts, a combinatorial of circles will form enclosures containing complex or specific concepts. In such a systematic system, it is possible to hierarchize concepts that will be in a relationship of implication, analogy, contradictory and contrary. By applying a similar systematic criterion, for we will develop a conceptual schema of the Pasu's psychic structure from which it will be possible to advance, subsequently, toward the comprehension of the lost Virya. Psychic structure of the animal man or Pasu at the time when the spirit spheres were to be enchained to the Pasu. Millions of years ago, the Lahasha had reached a determinate point in its phylogenetic evolution. This point is that which we are going to represent, leaving aside the history of said evolution. At that moment of its history the psychic structure of the Pasu was made up of two well-developed spheres and a third one in a slow process of formation. In the schema of Figure 11, the affective and rational spheres have been eccentrically represented in relation to the weaker Figure 11 sphere, preconscious, but more important from the potential point of view. In fact, sphere is, if you will, the key to the drama, since the evolutive failure of the Pasu was rooted in the almost null development of this sphere over millions of years of Manu activity. The entelchy of the Pasu, the perfectionment of matching the Manu archetype, was fundamentally based on the evolution of the conscious sphere, since it was necessary in order to complete the post-discovery of the work and, from the work, of the author, i.e., of the entities, of the entity, and of God. For this reason we have centered on sphere in Figure 11, although it is to spheres and, which are more developed, that we must pay more attention. The psychic structure of the Pasu was sustained, naturally, in the biological body, in certain highly differentiated systems, for example. The affective sphere was linked to the endocrine system and the rational sphere to the central nervous system, especially to the old brain or archencephalon. The preconscious sphere was arising from a rudimentary neocortex or new brain and, at that time, was only an epiphenomenon, a dim phosphorescence that was scarcely suggesting what later came to be, the conscious sphere, i.e., the seat of the conscious subject or soul of the Pasu. Spheres, and constitute the psychic structure proper. The nexus between it and the world is made through the sensorial sphere that, for this reason, appears in Figure 11 surrounding or including in its interior the psychic structure. But the sensorial sphere is also made up of the internal senses, of the viscera or interoceptors, of the movements of the body or proprioceptors, of pain or nociceptors, etc., in addition to the exteroceptors or receptors of exterior stimuli, hearing, sight, touch, etc. The pusu being a discovering entity of entities, its cognitive activity was concentrated in the sensorial sphere, through which it was receiving news of the world that was enabling it to adapt and conduct itself with intelligence in it. In the man of today, the lost virya, behavior is roughly made up of conduct and consciousness. Conduct is exterior behavior and consciousness, or mental life, is interior behavior. Consciousness can freely direct conduct by means of an energy placed at its disposal called will. But in the pusu, things were not occurring like that. Behavior was almost exclusively centered on conduct, and this was governed by an endless multiplicity of affixed pahasharns. That is why the conduct of the pusu is considered to have been determined by an instinctive will. However, behavior was not absolutely mechanical, since the conduct pahasharns had, for the most part, a rational origin. Although, also being produced and experienced, they were reproduced as acquired characteristics. In the schema of Figure 11, we can perceive the generation area of the instinctive will in the instinct's enclosure, which is formed by the intersection of the affective and rational spheres. The instinctive will was directed to fulfill different needs, conservation, appetite, reproduction, etc., and also to gregarious association. In this gregarious instinct, more than in any other activity, was where the human nature of the pusu was best seen. Every society is based on communication among its members. The higher objective of pusu society was the communal communication of the discovery of entities, or, in other words, to transform individual discovery into a collective knowledge. This means that the demiurge's plan for the pusu was eminently cultural. And thus it can be understood that the evolutive failure of the pusu manifested itself exteriorly in the cultural poverty reached by its societies. Hence the Hyperborean wisdom affirms that the spirits were captivated, enchained to the pusu, because they were necessary in order to produce culture. But culture, understood in this way, is something very different from the sum of human activity. Further ahead we will have the opportunity to go deeper into this concept. Archetypal memory and reason. A general description of the pusu's psychic structure has been made. In order to understand its function, especially to know how the pusu fulfills its finality of being a discoverer of entities, a giver of meaning to the material order of the universe, we must begin with the fundamental concept, memory. Referring to the schema of Figure 11, we can distinguish three classes of memory, each one of them linked to a sphere. Psychophysiological memory or habit memory corresponds to the affective sphere, archetypal memory is linked to the rational sphere, and representative memory is linked to the preconscious 5 sphere. Let us comment on each one of such memories. The first memory, psychophysiological, is basically receptive, specialized in retaining memories related to the world. It is therefore the seat of pahasharns of habit. In it is preserved everything necessary in order to ensure individual survival and, in addition, that which contributes to improving such a survival, i.e., the gregarious or social. This habit memory was what was mainly determining the instinctive will of the pusu. The third, representative memory, was incipient in the pusu and only also the enchainment of the spirit, when the pusu was transformed into a lost virya, was it sufficiently developed. It may be strange to note that the conscious sphere is considered as a form of memory, but a Lee Hashler thought will show that remembering, and representing what is remembered, is an essential characteristic of consciousness. This characteristic is closely related to the problem of temporality, with the faculty that the consciousness possesses of undying representations with an immanent time, psychic, in substitution of the actual time that might have corresponded to the original fact that is remembered and represented. In the section Functioning of the Conscious Sphere it will be demonstrated that the consciousness is a historical subject and that the conscious sphere is the history of the microcosm, that is to say, a kind of memory. The second, archetypal memory, which we deliberately leave for last, is that which most interests us for now. The concept of archetypal memory is so important that it can be outright affirmed that its ignorance, or its absence in any philosophical system, is for. Further ahead, we will study a fourth memory, blood memory, which is linked to the sphere of the egoic will, a sphere proper to the lost virya and, therefore, not yet defined. However, as will become clear in C of the next section, there is another important memory, denominated conceptual, situated between the archetypal memory and the representative memory. Enough to put it on the sidelines of the Hyperborean wisdom. We recommend, therefore, not to go any further without having deeply comprehended the following concept. Figure 9 shows an analogical schema of the one's universe, which is also usually called macrocosm. This denomination is adopted when it is understood that man is a minor mundas, a microcosm that reflects the major mundas or macrocosm. Such a conception is held since ancient times and, as far as Western thought is concerned, it is found in Greece, in the times of the pre-Socratics with Anaximenes, Pythagoras, etc., in Plato and Aristotle, in the Neoplatonists, Gnostics, Christian mystics, Kabbalists, alchemists, in modern philosophy with Leibniz, etc. and, of course, it forms part of the religious traditions of China, Japan, Tibet, and India, especially in esoteric Buddhism. However, in spite of such an enormous expansion, the principal consequences, even logical, that arise from the concept have remained to this day in the esoteric field. We, in affirming as a principle of the Hyperborean wisdom the ancient idea of the macrocosm, will find it necessary to emphasize relationships that are sometimes puerile but that, because of their esoteric nature, are usually not evident at all. But we will do so, even at the risk that, like in the well-known anecdote of the egg of Columbus, it may produce irritation in being made to notice something that we as a would believe we should have noticed ourselves. This is what occurs with the subject of reflection, also so much asserting, without reflection, that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. No longer does anyone notice that every reflection is an inverted copy of the original. This quality, which seems a puerility to emphasize, is a mahashya of the utmost importance, for its consideration allows us to easily comprehend the function of reason and the functioning of the rational sphere. Let us see, then, how the ancient concept should be interpreted. We already possess a description of the macrocosm according to the schema of Figure 9. The microcosm or material body of the Pasu, as a reflection of the macrocosm, must contain a replica of all its parts. This signifies that there has to be a sector in the material body that reproduces the archetypal plane, and there has to be, in said sector, the copy of all the universal archetypes, and that said copies have to be inverted with respect to the original. Such properties of the material body or microcosm enable us to elaborate the following definition: the whole of all the universal archetypes of the microcosm, inverted copies of the universal archetypes of the macrocosm, is denominated archetypal memory. Archetypal memory. However, even if the scalpel penetrates deep into the encephalic mass, molecular biology invents formulas for cellular macromolecules. Genetics succeeds in deciphering the code of the sugar-phosphate bonds of nucleic acids, or cybernetic systems engineers construct models that simulate brain functioning. Nevertheless, we say, in spite of these and other scientific marvels, no one succeeded nor will ever succeed in empirically discovering the archetypes, which, as we have said, constitute the whole brain. And this is not for lack of scientific ability, or for an error of methodology, but because of the essential impossibility of the human being, Pasu or Virya, to perceive the universal archetypes through the sensorial sphere. Certainly, not only the archetypes of a brain, but also those that sustain any entity, as long as they are universal, cannot be known through the sensorial sphere. Only its design, its particular terminus, can be known of the entity. This impossibility will be bihashya comprehended if we first define what is meant in the Hyperborean wisdom by reason. But, as here we are studying the psychic structure of the Pasu, the definition that we will give refers fundamentally to said primitive type of man. In the Virya, due to the evolution of the neocortex, the brain later allowed a greater rational specialization. However, the indicated impossibility still subsists and its origin continues to be that which we are now going to expound. For the biological sciences, the brain is a specialized cellular organization. For the Hyperborean wisdom, the brain is archetypal memory. The brain, or archetypal memory, functions by the will of a rational subject or reason, the activity of which can always be reduced to two basic operations, one transcendent and the other immanent. The first operation of reason is that of transcendent comparison and the second is immanent interpretation. The first operation has for its mission to discover the entity's design and the second, to interpret such a design, in semic terms. This is what will next be explained step by step. First operation, comparison. The scheme of figure 11 shows us the psychic structure of the pus surrounded by the sensorial sphere. In the animal man, the sensorial sphere fulfills the function of receiving stimuli from the world and converting them into nervous impulses destined for the brain, i.e., it is an intermediary between the internal and the external. But the sensorial sphere does not respond in the same way to different stimuli and itself varies considerably from one pus to another. Loose is denominated sensitivity. In figure 11, the circumference that limits the sensorial sphere is analogous to its sensitivity. Now, if we observe figure 11 we see that the sensitive affects the three spheres of the psychic structure. There is thus an affective sensitivity, a rational sensitivity, and a conscious sensitivity. And any of the three types of sensation can be the object of sensitive intuition. It should be clear that the rational operation that we are describing uses only that which reaches the rational sphere, i.e., the product of rational sensitivity. The object of sensitivity is the reality and, within this, the external entities that constitute it. In this, and in all the commentaries that follow, we are going to consider the sensorial sphere impressioned by an external entity, except in those cases in which the contrary is expressly clarified. We can now describe the first operation of reason, which we call transcendent because it deals with comparing the stimuli that pass through the sensorial sphere and that were caused by an external entity. That is, the transcendent operation of reason consists in comparing, automatically, that impression that rational sensitivity receives from an external entity. We know now, with precision, that the first operation of reason is a comparison. But a comparison with what? Because comparing consists in establishing relationships between two objects, which allow us to discover their differences or similarities. Answer: the entity is compared with the archetypes of the archetypal memory. Of course, it is necessary to go deeper into this answer until the discovering effect that the first operation exerts on the entity becomes comprehensible. As we said earlier, two termini coexist in the entity, one universal and the other particular. The universal terminus is the archetype, or the set of archetypes, if it is composite, that sustains it as an entity and toward which aims its evolution as a finality. The particular terminus is the design that the demiurge has affixed in every entity as a suprafinality. The first terminus makes the entity a being in itself, the second terminus says that the entity is a being for man. When an entity impressions the rational sensitivity, the first operation of reason consists in submihashing the impression received to a comparison with the archetypal memory. In this memory there will always be at least one archetype that is an inverted copy of the universal archetype that sustains the entity, and with it the comparison is made, i.e., reason compares only one universal terminus of the entity with its inverted copy, a particular archetype of the archetypal memory. It is easily understood that this can only occur in this way, since only inverted copies of the universal archetypes, the entelechial finality of the entities, exist in the archetypal memory, and no copy or reference exists of the particular designs of each entity, the suprafinality of being for man. What arises from the confrontation between the entity's universal archetype and its inverted copy of the archetypal memory? Answer: nothingness. It is like adding plus with minus, a positive unit with a negative unit, its result is zero. This signifies that reason automatically eliminates the universal terminus of the entity and leaves the particular terminus or design discovered. Only then can the entity be known and named. But this naming is not possible, as some believe, because man is a logos, the true logos is the demiurge who has designated the entities, the pasu, osa its discovery, can only repeat that which was previously assigned to the entity. Leaving the problem of knowledge for later, one can now understand, osa deciphering the first operation of reason, why we were affirming that there is an impossibility for the human being, pasu or virya, to perceive the universal archetypes through the sensorial sphere. The impossibility exists whenever the apprehension is rational and the apprehended entity is an exteriorly entity. But it must also be understood, and once and for all, that reason is a function of the archetypal memory, i.e., of the brain, and that the first rational operation invariably consists in the elimination of the universal archetype, the universal terminus of the entity, by a comparison with its inverted copy. This is so and cannot be altered because the archetypal memory is a structure, i.e., a whole, the parts of which are solidly linked, while reason is a function that consists in connecting certain elements of that structure, but without modifying the structure itself. In the brain, according to official science, rational operations consist of certain bioelectrical interconnections or synapses that are made between clusters of specialized cells. However, no matter how much one thinks, and no matter how many networks of neuronal interconnections that such thinking produces, the cellular structure of the brain itself is never permanently modified. Just as it is not possible for neuronal activity to modify the structure of the brain, neither does the rational function modify the archetypal structure, and this equivalence is exact because the brain and the archetypal memory are one and the same thing, only that the neurophysiological explanation belongs to the official science of the West and the structural explanation to the Hyperborean wisdom. The impossibility of perceiving the universal archetypes that sustain external entities is also denominated unrepresentability. By this word is meant that the representation, i.e., the mental vision, of the universal archetypes is not possible, which in no way implies that they cannot be known. But the knowledge must come from entities, exist in the archetypal memory, and no copy or reference exists of the particular designs of each entity, the suprafinality of being for man. What arises from the confrontation between the entity's universal archetype and its inverted copy of the archetypal memory? Answer: nothingness. It is like adding plus with minus, a positive unit with a negative unit, its result is zero. This signifies that reason automatically eliminates the universal terminus of the entity and leaves the particular terminus or design discovered. Only then can the entity be known and named. But this naming is not possible, as some believe, because man is a logos. The true logos is the demiurge who has designated the entities, the pasu, osa its discovery, can only repeat that which was previously assigned to the entity. Leaving the problem of knowledge for later, one can now understand, osa deciphering the first operation of reason, why we were affirming that there is an impossibility for the human being, pasu or virya, to perceive the universal archetypes through the sensorial sphere. The impossibility exists whenever the apprehension is rational and the apprehended entity is an exteriorly entity. But it must also be understood, and once and for all, that reason is a function of the archetypal memory, i.e., of the brain, and that the first rational operation invariably consists in the elimination of the universal archetype, the universal terminus of the entity, by a comparison with its inverted copy. This is so and cannot be altered because the archetypal memory is a structure, i.e., a whole, the parts of which are solidly linked, while reason is a function that consists in connecting certain elements of that structure, but without modifying the structure itself. In the brain, according to official science, rational operations consist of certain bioelectrical interconnections or synapses that are made between clusters of specialized cells. However, no matter how much one thinks, and no matter how many networks of neuronal interconnections that such thinking produces, the cellular structure of the brain itself is never permanently modified. Just as it is not possible for neuronal activity to modify the structure of the brain, neither does the rational function modify the archetypal structure, and this equivalence is exact because the brain and the archetypal memory are one and the same thing, only that the neurophysiological explanation belongs to the official science of the West and the structural explanation to the Hyperborean wisdom. The impossibility of perceiving the universal archetypes that sustain external entities is also denominated unrepresentability. By this word is meant that the representation, i.e., the mental vision, of the universal archetypes is not possible, which in no way implies that they cannot be known. But the knowledge must come from a confrontation carried out on a suprarational level, in another sphere, the Pasu in the pre-conscious sphere, the Virya in the conscious sphere. Second operation, relating the second operation of reason is denominated immanent because it consists in establishing relationships between exclusively interior objects of the psychic structure. When the entity has been discovered, by the first operation, it establishes relationships between its interiorized particular design and the archetypes of the archetypal memory, and with the archetypes among themselves. But, in order to explain this operation, it is necessary to previously describe the cultural structure, which will be done in the next section. As a conclusion to this brief exposition of the archetypal memory, it is worth noting that reason, its function, in the first operation takes the external entity and, also eliminating the universal terminus, discovers the particular that there is in it. This going from the universal to the particular is the most general kind of deduction. The deductive essence, all deduction is always a posteriori to this first operation, but, in its form, derivable from it. The first operation is a priori to any other reasoning about the entity because it is indispensable for discovering the entity and placing it under observation. But, by taking the external entity, lost in the universal, and situating it in the internal as a particular design, we are making a transcendent deduction. On the contrary, the second operation will take the discovered entity in its particular design and relate it to the archetypes of the archetypal memory, i.e., to the universal of the microcosm. This going from the particular to the universal is the most general kind of induction. The inductive essence, all induction is derived from the second operation. But, in taking the internally discovered entity, and relating it to archetypes of the microcosm, an immanent induction is being made, i.e., circumscribed in the interior of the animal man-being or Pasu. Functioning of the Pasu's cultural structure with the same reserves and considerations that we made when proposing the model of the sphere, we are going to use the structural model in order to complete the conceptual description of the Pasu's psychic structure. Why should we use a new model? Because here we are going to develop the following concept: the archetypal memory is the given, that which the animal man inherits complete and which he cannot modify. However, founded on the archetypal memory, there is something that is constructed throughout life, the cultural structure. The answer is, then, in order to grasp the cultural structure, the growth of which is the product of the operations of reason, we will utilize the structural model because it keeps the necessary and sufficient correspondences. The structural model. The first thing that we must do, before dealing with the cultural structure, is to acquire a clear notion of what a structure is. In order to do this we will proceed inductively, starting from the intuition of a simple geometric structure and extending said intuition to structures of greater complexity. In Figure 12 we have represented an elementary geometric structure widely utilized as a model in physics, known as the body-centered cubic lattice of a crystal. It is possible to imagine structures of this type in which the polygon of the face is other than the square, thereby obtaining not cubes but polyhedra such as the octahedron, dodecahedron, icosahedron, etc. A lattice is made up of the linking of a set of similar polyhedra. However, the lattice that we need as a model is not made up of similar polyhedra, but must be able to include in its structure all possible polyhedra and must ensure the possible connection of one with another. We will now study the geometric structure of Figure 12. From simple observation we deduce that it is made up of 4 elements, certain protuberances at the vertexes and center of the cube called nodes, the bond between nodes, the space that occupies its extension, and the time that enables it to last or change. But the first thing that calls our attention is the interrelation that links all its members, given that it is possible to reach any of the nodes starting from any other by simply moving along the bonds. This topological quality allows us to state that in a structure, the whole conditions the part, but, such a conditioning does not come only from bonds that prevent the independence of the nodes. In addition, the members are articulated in the total form in such a way that, for example, out destroying the cubic form, and, also, there is an interaction between the members since, if in the same figure we attribute for example mass to the cubic structure, it turns out that by eliminating a node the static equilibrium that it could have reached is altered. On the other hand, by subjecting the cubic structure of figure 12 to dynamic conditions, for example, a displacement or a rotation, it can be concluded that the members are solidary and that they are all functionally interpenetrated. Summarizing, we can characterize the structure as an organization or bond of members articulated in a whole, interdependent, solidary, interactive, and functionally interpenetrated. B-nodes and bonds of the cultural structure. The archetypal memory or brain is inherited, unmodifiable, but its function, reason, is capable of carrying out a permanent structural construction, at least during the entire life of the puzzle. But this construction does not come from an act of choice, from the will of the subject, but from reason's mode of being. In effect, reason, by the mere fact of acting, produces elements of the cultural structure, members that are linked to the whole and remain definitively articulated. The function of reason as a producer of the cultural structure obeys the finality that the demiurge has affixed to the destiny of the puzzle, to be a discoverer of entities and, from the entities, to be a producer of culture. Culture, gregarious, social, or collective application of knowing the entities, is the fact that truly gives meaning to the world, because of its external character to the microcosm, for being seated in the macrocosm. Further ahead we will have the opportunity to study the cultural fact in the framework of the historical fact of the Kali Yuga. We will apply the just stated structural model in order to explain the structuring effect of reason. Recalling the quadruple constitution of a structure, we have to begin by asking, what is the space in which the cultural structure is constructed? Answer: the cultural structure is a substratum of the affective and rational spheres. This answer leads us to the problem of the sphere's nature. What are the spheres made of? Here we affirm the energetic nature of the pussy's psychic structure, and such a definition may generate the prejudice that the concept of energy is being applied to the psyche. Against this objection we reply that, contrarily, because the psyche is energetic, a concept of energy exists. So, the psychic substance is energy, a higher form of Mahashur in which the Lahashur is reduced to pure force. The space in an energetic sphere is always reducible to vector space, which justifies the choice of the structural method for its topological correspondences. The cultural structure, which is formed by the action of reason, takes place in the affective and rational spheres as a substratum of these, i.e., its place is at the bohasham, deep down, at the base, near the archetypal memory, the brain, which is what supports the affective and rational spheres. Let us now see how this structure is formed. Let us recall the first operation of reason. Reason compares, in the archetypal memory, the entity's universal archetype with the inverted archetype. From this comparison the entity's universal archetype is eliminated, leaving only the particular terminus or design. But, in order to carry out the comparison, reason has had to locate the inverted archetype and, once located, confront it with the entity, i.e., with the impression that the external entity has produced in the rational sensitivity, as previously defined. Here is the origin of the cultural structure, as a product of the locating that the first operation of reason performs on the inverted archetype. A second effect occurs. The first effect is the elimination of the universal terminus, the second is the actualization, in the microcosm, of the inverted archetype. The first effect is, therefore, the cause of the second. The first operation of reason thus produces, in addition to the transcendent deduction, in which it eliminates the universal terminus, an archetypal actualization, in the microcosm, of the eliminated universal terminus inverted copy. Let us leave aside, for the moment, the first effect, the elimination of the universal terminus, and turn our attention to the actualization of the inverted archetype. If we recall that the archetypal memory is analogous, in the microcosm, to the archetypal plane of the macrocosm, we can verify that the actualization of an inverted archetype is analogous to that of any universal archetype. On the archetypal plane, archetypes are perfect but potential beings. The actualization of an archetype consists in its manifestation on a plane of realization. When this plane is, for example, Mahashur, the manifestation produces material entities that participate to a greater or lesser degree in the archetypal perfection. In the East, it is said that the manifestation of the archetypes on the material plane is brought about by the impulse of the demiurge's breath, i.e., by a cosmic exhalation, a universal pneuma. But this exhalation is not a mere rhythmic expulsion, for it possesses direction, since it is directed to the plane of realization, the direction that determines the plasmating impulse of the universal archetypes to be directed to the material plane, and not to any other world, is the intention of the demiurge. It is this intention that impulses the entities to evolve toward the entelchy of the archetypes, and, as breath is synonymous with will, it is said that the intention is the direction of the demiurge's will. Entelchy is the finality toward which tend the phenomenic processes that constitute the entity's reality. But in every entity there are, as we have seen, two finalities, one universal and the other particular. This is due to the existence, in every entity, of a double demiurgic intention. A first intention plasmates and impulses the entity toward the archetype's entelchy of which it participates, it is its finality. A second intention designates the entity a being for man, it is its suprafinality. Therefore, the entity is the act of the universal archetype but an essentially intentional act, produced by a directioning of the demiurge's will. Let us now consider the archetypal memory or brain of the Pasu, which is a reflection, an inverted copy, of the archetypal plane. Reason is a function of the archetypal memory, but reason is something that moves, that establishes relationships. What is the force that impulses the reason of the Pasu? Answer: the instinctive will. Reason is directed toward the inverted archetype, of an entity passed to the senses, moved by the instinctive will. This signifies that the reference established between the inverted archetype and the entity, for the purposes of comparison, is not passive but active, not static but dynamic, i.e., it is intentional. Naturally, such a reference has nothing to do with consciousness because the Lahashur is a historical subject that was not yet existing in the Pasu. In any case, such an intentional reference was, and is, subconscious. The intentional character with which reason refers to the located archetype is what produces its actualization and, with it, the growth of the cultural structure. But the actualization of an archetype must be carried out on a plane of realization. What is, in the microcosm, this plane on which the inverted archetypes manifest themselves? Answer: the psyche or soul of the Pasu, concretely, in the depth of the affective and rational spheres. This answer coincides with that which we had previously given to the question of the space in which the cultural structure is constructed, since we said then that this was a substratum of the affective and rational spheres. Now we can complete the concept by saying that the space that a cultural structure occupies is the archetype's plane of realization of the archetypal memory, that is, the energetic spheres of the psyche. We have not yet explained how the cultural structure is constructed, but rather where it takes place. We will be able to begin this explanation also presenting a fundamental concept that, due to its importance, should not be forgotten in any of the subsequent analyses. It is a mahashur of the following: every psychic phenomenon is of a semic character. Without entering into the problem of the continuity that the Pasu's psyche has to maintain, as an energetic sphere, it is unquestionable that every psyche is the deposit of multiphenomenic content. The above affirmation affirms that the immanent diversity of the psychic is semic. Accordingly, psychic contents are symbolic, but there is no need to be confused. The symbol is not a mere addition to the psychic content, a property of the Lahashur, but the content itself, its essence. In this way, the semic is the essence of the psychic, and that is why every fact that possesses a psychic termination manifests itself semically or polysemically. We will now study how the cultural structure is constructed. We have already stated that its origin was rooted in the actualization that the rational reference was producing in the inverted archetype as the second effect of the comparison. The actualization of an inverted archetype, analogously to that of a universal archetype of the macrocosm, manifests itself on a plane of realization, the psyche. But, as we have recently seen, such a manifestation has to be semic. Bol. In other words, when reason locates an archetype in the archetypal memory, the referential intentionality impulses it to manifest itself in the psyche where it is structured as a principle or a simple symbol. Let us now consider the first operation of reason, complete in its two effects. In comparing the entity with the archetypal memory, the confrontation of the universal archetype of the entity with its inverted copy is produced, i.e., two opposites are opposed. From this operation results, as the first effect, the elimination, or negation, of the entity's universal archetype and, with it, the discovery of its design or suprafinality, and as the second effect, the manifestation, or affirmation, of the inverted archetype in the cultural structure as a principle, i.e., occupying the place of a node. The first effect, as we see, has discovered the entity in its design. Let us see what happens next. First of all, we must qualify the discovery of the design as a transcendence of the external entity, which thus situates itself beyond the sensorial sphere. Indeed, while the universal archetype can never be seen outside of the entity, nor in the entity itself, for it is absolutely immanent, the design of the entity is ready to be formen, to transcend all barriers and to reveal itself in fullness. In other words, the design becomes an interior object. As we said before, equivalence does not exist in the archetypal memory for the design of entities, since, precisely, the finality of the animal man is to discover this design and to give meaning to the world. That is why the design, as an interior object, is the subject of the second operation of reason, relating. What does reason do with the design of the entity? Answer: it interprets it. In order to interpret the design, reason searches the archetypal memory's archetypes, those most adequate or congruent, and with them it forms a schema of the entity. Here there is not, as in the first operation, any elimination of archetypes. On the contrary, there is the affirmation of one or several of them, necessary in order to interpret the design, i.e., as an effect of the second operation of reason, which establishes relationships between the entity's design and the archetypal memory, there is the actualization of one or more archetypes. But an actualization is a manifestation in the psychic sphere, in the domain of the cultural structure. Here is what occurs: the set of actualized archetypes, which intervene in the interpretation of a design, manifests itself in the psyche as a complex symbol that represents the entity's schema and is structured where the bonds are. Such bonds are denominated relationships. Of energetic substance and of semic essence, the members of which are complex symbols that relate or bond to simple symbols or principles. But up to now we have only seen how a node and a bond are constructed. We still need to know how the cultural structure grows and what relationship it has with the total psychic structure of the Pasu in order, from there, to comprehend its function. This will be the object of the next article. Also we say two things about the second operation of reason. The second operation, which we previously described as an immanent induction, consists, as we now see, in interpreting the design of the entity by means of relationships between archetypes of the archetypal memory. This operation, interpreting, presupposes the existence of a criterion. But such a criterion is not the product of the Pasu's decision but, on the contrary, every decision is a posteriori to the criterion and is conditioned by it. This is so because it is a par-earn criterion. Reason operates impulsed by the instinctive will, i.e., subject to conduct par-earns, and the second operation adjusts itself to a par-earn that is a criterion's pure form. But this rational criterion, which intervenes a priori to understanding, is manifestly inherited because it constitutes a form or mode of reason, i.e., of the archetypal memories or brain's function, which is given because it is inherited. By this we mean to emphasize that the interpretation of the design will vary from one Pasu to another according to the degree of precision that the hereditary rational criterion permits each one to attain. See The cultural structure as memory. A node of the cultural structure or principle is the semic correspondence of an archetype of the archetypal memory. A bond or relationship is the semic correspondence of an entity's design, its schema, according to the interpretation made by reason. As soon as the life of the puzzle begins, as soon as its sensorial sphere is exposed to the impression of the world's entities, multiple nodes and similar bonds are being added to the cultural structure by the archetypal actualization that reason produces. The cultural structure grows, then, constantly, both in the number of members and in the complexity of the lahashis, while what is already structured remains as a substratum of the affective and rational spheres. This permanence inevitably poses the problem of time, i.e., that of the relationship between transcendent time or the time of entities and immanent time or psychic time, the solution of which will be given later. Archetypal, like the brain, but experiential, i.e., the product of the entity's experience. The archetypal memory is passive and static, hereditary. The cultural structure, as memory, is active and dynamic, experiential. For reasons that we will see later, the cultural structure is denominated by the Hyperborean wisdom, also, conceptual memory. Of course, the objects of this memory, what is truly memorized, are the relationships between principles, since the principles are merely the semic actualizations of the archetypal memory's archetypes. Relationships, or bonds, of the cultural structure constitute, for the puzzle, the truth of the entities, since they represent the rational interpretation of the design, and, therefore, an explanation of the psychic structure's functioning has to primarily aim at revealing the nature of such bonds or relationships. It should not be surprising, then, that we will devote to the lahasha the greater part of the next few articles. Principles and relationships as systems. If we recall our arrangement that, unless otherwise clarified, all explanations would be exemplified by external entities, we can delve into the definition of a relationship. For the puzzle, a relationship is, first of all, the truth of the entity. But, here it must be observed that we do not say the essence but the truth of the entity. This distinction indicates that the essence of the entity is the design, while the relationship is a rational correlate, the interpretation of the design or schema, the truly known, and, therefore, the truth of the entity. The truth of the entity is memorized by the cultural structure as a complex symbol or relationship, i.e., as a semic bond between principles or simple symbols. Now, what is a complex symbol made up of? A set of simple symbols structured in order to constitute the schema of the entity. A complex symbol, a relationship, or bond of the cultural structure, is, in turn, a semic structure of a lesser degree denominated substructure. This property of the complex symbol or relationship, of being a substructure of simple symbols, poses a problem that requires a clarification before continuing with its study. In effect, if a complex symbol or relationship is a bond between simple symbols or principles, can these principles also be included in the set of simple symbols in which the complex symbol consists, i.e., can the principles be repeated in the cultural structure? Answer: simple symbols can exist either as principles where the nodes are or as constituent elements of complex symbols where the bonds are. The difference lies in the potency. Principles are passive potencies while relationships are active potencies. But as the concept of potency requires the consideration of transcendent time, we will not enter now into its definition, as this will be done further ahead. Suspending such a definition until then, let us recall that principles come from the first operation of reason, when the universal archetype of the entity is compared with the inverted archetype of the archetypal memory. It is this intentional reference that actualizes the archetype in the cultural structure as a principle or passive potency, but the elimination of the universal archetype has caused the discovery of the design, of the entities being for man, and reason interprets this revelation by means of the second operation, which consists in referring the design to the archetypes necessary for obtaining a schema, the archetypes of reference, among which may appear the same as those used to eliminate the universal, are actualized in the cultural structure by forming a complex symbol, relationship, or active potency. The representation, in the cultural structure, of an inverted archetype as a node is denominated principle. If, in addition, the same archetype is represented in a relationship as a semic element of its substructure, such an element is denominated as an archetypal symbol. If an archetypal symbol and a principle represent the same archetype, they differ only in potency. The principle possesses an passive potency and the archetypal symbol, like the whole relationship, has an active potency. The same inverted archetype can, thus, have a symbolic correspondence with a principle or a semic element of the relationship. However, it is fundamental to understand this. Although the same simple symbol can represent both the principle and a semic element of a relationship, it will never be structured more than once as a principle or node and will instead be substructured countless times as a semic element of relationships or bonds. This means that, once reason has compared an entity with an archetype and the Lahasha has manifested and structured itself as a principle or passive potency, it does not matter how many times this operation is repeated. With that or with other entities, the archetype never manifests itself more than once as a principle. In every case, what occurs is that the repeated rational references to an archetype, for its comparison, increase the passive potency of the corresponding principle or node. The increased potency is necessary because, principles being something unique in the cultural structure, they must support all the relationships that refer to them. We are in the case, for example, in which a given node in Figure 12 would have to support countless bonds. For this, it would be necessary to foresee some way to reinforce the node at each new bond, thus avoiding the weakening of the structure. This reinforcement is carried out, in the principles, by the increase of the passive potency. This condition of a unique, unrepeatable node that each principle has should give an idea of the complexity of the cultural structure. Think of any principle, for example the number 1, and you will be able to imagine the impressive quantity of relationships with which it must be linked in our own cultural structure. Up to this point we have clarified the fact that an archetype is represented by a single principle and also by very many simple symbols substructured in the various relationships. We will now go on to study, in greater detail, the complexion of the relationships. In the structural model that we are using, a relationship between principles is analogous to a bond between nodes in Figure 12, i.e., to a cylindrical bar, such as the one represented in Figure 13. The actual dimensions of the bond are space, time, and substance. Naturally, the space occupied by the cylinder can be characterized in turn by qualitative dimensions such as length, width or thickness, surface area, volume, etc. The analogy between a relationship and a cylindrical bond will allow us to define certain characteristic dimensions. In a relationship, time and substance are reduced into the concept of potency, which will be defined in the next paragraph. As for space, the analogy is established with respect to the length and volume of a cylindrical bond. Summarizing, every relationship is defined on the basis of 3 dimensions: its extension, analogous to length, its comprehension, equivalent to volume, and its potency. Minus the potency, we will define extension and comprehension, making the clarification that, in general, they should be considered valid, not only for schema 2 of external entities, but for all relationships, whatever the represented entity may be. The extension of a relationship, analogous to the length of a bond, denotes the class of all simple symbols that are involved in the substructure of the complex symbol or relationship. The longer a relationship is, the greater the number of semic elements that it encompasses. The comprehension of a relationship, analogous to the volume of the bond, indicates how close the schematic truth is to coinciding with the essence of the entity or design. Thus the comprehension is the substructure itself, the schematic schema of the entity, the truth of which the relationship represents. That is why its exactitude for comprehending the essence of the entity depends on the interpretation made by the second operation of reason, i.e., it depends on the hereditary criterion. A greater volume of the bond is equivalent to a greater comprehension of the relationship, i.e., the relationship is more comprehensive in properties corresponding to the design structured as simple symbols. We have spoken of the principles and of the relationships, and now we know some more about both. But if we consider them together and pay attention to some common properties, we will soon be in a position to study, in its totality, the functioning of the Pasu's cultural structure, just as the title of this section was promising. First of all, let us note that the principles do not come from a sensitive intuition but have been structured by its effect. The principles, as a semic representation of innate archetypes, are a priori to all reasoning or reflection and are determinants of understanding. The Pasu will find or intuit them and identify them with pure symbols, innate ideas, numbers, mental categories, etc., or will improperly call them archetypes. On the contrary, relationships have their origin in sensitive intuition or are pure creations of reason. They constitute, for the Pasu, the substance of all rational thought. It is evident that the cultural structure is made up of a small number of principles and a countless number of relationships. But, unlike what occurs in the cubic structure of Figure 12, the conditions imposed on the cultural structure, it must be able to include all possible polyhedra and must ensure the possible connection of one with another, cause that a relationship can be connected with multiple principles. Then we would not be in the analogy of the cylindrical bar and this could invalidate our conclusions. That is why, in order to dispel any doubt and facilitate the exposition, we will use the notion of a system. Parts do not exist in the structure but members, which are supportive, interactive, interdependent, etc., with the whole. Hence a system, which may be a sector or the whole structure, should be considered as an arbitrary abstraction rather than as a part. Structural morphology divides systems into simple and complex. Accordingly, we will define, in general, a system as the class of all relationships that are linked by common principles. Likewise, a simple system is the class of all relationships that are linked with a pair of opposite principles. It is useful to define an operation denominated reduction in the following terms: such a function exists in every simple system between the principles and the relationships that it is always possible to assimilate the similar symbols of each relationship and reduce the number of bonds. By a systematic reduction, it will always be possible to topologically simplify the polyhedra class to its minimum expression, one bond and two nodes, i.e., one relationship between two principles. We thus arrive at a minimum system, represented in Figure 13, in which the relationship is linked at the beginning and end of its extension with two opposite principles. It is then said to be a dialectical relationship. The systematic Figure 13 reduction, considered as a mental function, is also called a rational synthesis. It is clear that the minimum system of Figure 13 is a substructure, according to the definition that we previously gave for a complex symbol. Consequently, we can generalize the reduction for every simple system in the following way: every simple system is a substructure susceptible to a semiotic reduction. But, and this should be even clearer, only relationships are reducible, principles are absolutely irreducible. In any case, if every simple system can be brought into the form of Figure 13, the general validity of the previous definitions for principles and relations is confirmed. We are now in a position to set forth the concept of a complex system. It is a substructure that possesses n pairs of opposite Figure 11b principles and that, by a systematic reduction, is broken down into a set of n simple systems. Henceforth, when we say system, it should be understood as a simple system, unless otherwise clarified. The rational thinking of the Pasu are descriptions so extensive, we surely wish to know how the Pasu thinks. Of course, the first and second operations of reason already imply thinking, as does the activity of the cultural structure and the conscious sphere. In order to avoid confusions, we will begin by defining the meaning of these terms and specifying their scope. Thinking is the activity of the psychic structure, made up, according to Figure 11b, of the affective, rational, and conscious spheres. Thus, it is clear that thinking is an activity that can happen in any of these spheres. In another section, however, it will be demonstrated that thinking obeys an inevitable hierarchical sequence. Temporally, thinking is first located in the structure of the brain. The living brain constructs the cultural structure which, a posteriori, is also animated by thinking. The living cultural structure constructs the conscious sphere and, a posteriori, is also animated by thinking. When we say, for example, thinking or because of thinking, etc., it is to be assumed that such a thinking can occur in any sphere of the psychic structure, and the text is to be probed for the appropriate reference. Always anticipating definitions, which will be duly substantiated further ahead, let us consider that thought is the moment of thinking. In other words, thought is the momentary act of thinking. In a following section we will see that such a moment presents a double temporality. On the one hand, it registers an actual duration in transcendent time or the time of the macrocosm, and on the other hand it registers an immanent time proportional to the energetic intensity of the thought. On the other hand, the particular microcosm of the Pasu is the product of a monad and an archetype, i.e., the monad sustains the particular microcosm that evolves according to the process of a universal archetype or Manu. But the monad never descends to Mahashur, but manifests itself in the microcosm as a being of a very subtle body, the function of which is, to assimilate the reached evolutive degree and to maintain it when the organic disintegration called death takes place. Ing maintains what has evolved in that life in order to apply it in the life of other microcosms, always advancing toward entelchi. It is understood, then, that the soul, by its function of sustaining and impulsing it toward entelchial individuation, must be present at every point of the microcosm. In truth, there is no function in the microcosm that is not ultimately grounded in the soul, but, from the structural point of view, it is useful to distinguish between its different faculties. By faculty of the soul, the potency with which it acts in a structure is to be understood. In this sense, sensitivity and intelligence are, for example, faculties. Now, in the Pasu, thinking is the principal faculty of the soul. Or, in other words, thinking is the manifestation of the soul in the psychic structure. But this manifestation has an unmistakable character. It is the only faculty with which the soul directly expresses the unity of the monad. This is why it is said that thinking is the act of a thinking subject, the soul as a subject that constantly tends toward asserting its own individuality, is the unmistakable reflection of the monad's unity. We said at the beginning that thinking can happen in any sphere of the psychic structure. The concept of a thinking subject will allow us to understand this faculty of the soul with more precision. First of all, we must pay attention to the following principle: every subject requires a structure in which to manifest itself. That is to say, the subject cannot exist without a vehicle for its manifestation. What always exists, even also the death of the Pasu, is the transmigrating soul, but not the subject, which is only an aspect of the soul characteristic of the state of incarnation, an objective of the Pasu's finality. In synthesis, the subject is a function of the structure in the microcosm. In order to expound our thesis on the original psychic structure of the Pasu and the subsequent enchainment of the spirit, we have distinguished three basic structures: the archetypal memory or brain, the cultural structure, and the conscious sphere. Well, each one of such structures can be animated by the thinking subject, according to the just examined principle. Without forehashing that we are always dealing with the same subject, we will denominate rational subject or reason to the thinking located in the archetypal memory or brain, cultural subject to the thinking that occurs over the cultural structure, and, lastly, conscious subject or historical subject to the thinking proper to the conscious sphere, which will be the main topic of study in the next article. The force that moves the subject is the will. Thus, the instinctive will enables reason, or the rational subject, to act in the archetypal memory. The cultural will impulses the cultural subject to animate the cultural structure, and the conscious will makes it possible for the conscious subject to animate the conscious sphere. In Figure 11b it can be seen that in the systematic analogical representation of eccentric circles, enclosure corresponds to the cultural will, which is active in the three spheres, and for causes that will be explained in F of the next article. On the other hand, enclosure, of the instinctive will, is formed only by the intersection of spheres and, which signifies that reason is volitively independent of the conscious sphere. It can act, and in fact always acts, instinctively, that is to say, automatically. In all that follows in this section, we will concentrate on the description and functional analysis of the cultural structure, which is why any reference or mention of thinking must be understood as corresponding to the cultural subject. With this criterion of thought, we will only refer to that which the instinctive and rational subjects produce, and we will denominate it rational thought, in order to differentiate it from irrational thoughts, which will be studied in another section. For the same reason, we will say, rational thinking, alluding to that thinking that only apprehends rational thoughts. Naturally, such an apprehension is only possible because thinking is a volitive subject. Taking into account all these definitions and clarifications, we can already consider the following property: the rational thought of the pus originates, in all cases, over the cultural structure and, from there, emerges toward the higher strata of the psyche, that is to say, toward the conscious sphere. Such a transit of thought can only be understood in the light of the concepts of potency and time, which will be studied in the following section. Here we are going to limit the explanation around the origin of rational thought, since it is produced in the cultural structure. How should it be understood, then, that thought is produced on the cultural structure? Answer, literally, i.e., if we do not forget that the cultural structure is an analogical model, the answer is literal: thought is produced over the structure, in its principles and relations, that is, in the systems. That is why rational thought is systematic. Since this answer does not allow us to see much, we will try to understand it through an allegory. Let us suppose that we perform the vivisection of an animal and, by means of a craniotomy, we leave its brain exposed. We observe it attentively and affirm, it is a cellular structure, and, it is alive. But, after a closer inspection, we see that there are different types of activity within said structure: bioelectrical, biochemical, neuronal, hematic, etc. What moves are ions, in the biochemical phenomena, molecules; in the neuronal phenomena, the same cell, stimulated by a nerve impulse, connects with another, moves, producing synapses; in the hematic phenomena, a protein molecule, etc. That is to say, in the broad framework of life, which characterizes said cellular structure or brain, we distinguish several different movements that come from different areas of functional activity. How have we distinguished these movements? How have they become clear to us? We have distinguished them, in the first place, because we did not consider the brain as a whole, as an organic whole, but we made an abstraction of certain parts, the cells, the arteries, veins and tissues, etc. And, secondly, they have become clear because we observe what has been abstracted under different lights and optics. Let us now observe the complex network of the cultural structure. When we say that the pusu thinks, we are in a case analogous to the brain lives, we imply the essential activity of the organism. Thinking is the state of the cultural structure's essential activity, analogous to the vitality of the brain's cellular structure. But in the Lahasha we were distinguishing certain movements, proper to the organic functions, which became clear by abstracting these functions from the structural totality and observing them separately, i.e., by formally framing the functional area and considering it as a phenomenon in itself. In the same way a pusu's rational thought is a distinct and clear movement that is produced in certain regions of the cultural structure. In other words, thinking is the vitality of the cultural structure and thought is the experience of a system, in such a structure. The structure is, then, full of mental activity, like the brain teeming with life. The pusu performs a rational operation and a special movement is produced over a system, it is rational thought. But now we understand why that answer should be interpreted literally: rational thought is only a localized activity over a system of the cultural structure. However, this over should not give rise to misunderstandings. Thought is not an activity that occurs on the surface of the system's elements. It is not in this superficial sense that we say over. Thought is something distinct from the system, and that is why it occurs over the system. It can move from one system to another or remain over one of them. And it can do all this because rational thought is the experience of the system or the system experienced as thought, i.e., that which is actually thought during thinking. An analogical way to imagine the fact that, in a cultural structure, a rational thought occurs over a system is to suppose that at that moment the system is illuminated. adjacent node or bond. On the basis of such an assumption, which we will see is not entirely without an actual foundation, we will analogically speak of this or that system as illuminated by a thought. We were wondering at the beginning how a Pussu's rational thought would be, and now we know that it is produced as a part of thinking's activity in which consists the cultural structure's vitality, over a system, and that this system is illuminated when it occurs. Now, these thoughts are not produced spontaneously in the cultural structure but are caused by either of the first two subjects, either by the instinctive subject, that is, by the two operations of reason, or by the cultural subject, which only exists, naturally, a posteriori to the cultural structure. So far we have considered reason as a structure of schemata, but it is easy to notice that the sensorial sphere is not always affected by new entities, or that reason can carry out mental operations that do not refer to external entities. However primitive the Pussu may be, it can always make intuitive abstractions about the entities, i.e., it can differentiate them, extract them from among the remaining entities, and can, also, make decisions about them. In these cases, although the cultural structure is in the process of formation and there is not yet an independent cultural subject, the operations of reason act as an instinctive subject and are capable of producing thoughts in the cultural structure. The process is as follows: the second operation of reason establishes references between archetypes of the archetypal memory, or, what is the same, certain bioelectric paths are generated by synapses in the neurophysiological network of the brain. Rational thought is produced because, simultaneously with such brain activity, a system of the cultural structure is illuminated, that is, cultural thinking perceives the experience of a system. The question is, by virtue of what process is the neural pathway transferred to the cultural structure as a system? Answer: there is a biunivocal correspondence between the archetypal memory or brain structure and the cultural structure. Here we should clarify that the term biunivocal is used in the restricted meaning of a two-way correspondence of the structures and in no way implies a mathematical homeomorphism, but an analogical one. It is, therefore, only a didactic concept utilized out of convenience, as the whole structural model is also, without cue prejudice that such a model may or may not describe the truth of the actual facts. We will only be able to assure that, in the biunivocal correspondence between a bioelectrical configuration produced in the brain by the instinctive subject and the cultural structure, an equivalent schema is transferred to the lahasha, which preserves from the former only its topological invariants, i.e., its essential qualities. By saying that there is a biunivocal correspondence between the two structures, we are affirming the possibility that transference is produced in both directions, i.e., that the activity of reason produces thoughts in the cultural structure as well as that certain thoughts of the cultural structure, generated in it by the cultural subject, cause activity in the archetypal memory. However, as we have already made clear, there can only be transference in the latter direction, a posteriori to the cultural structure, i.e., when there is actually a cultural subject in the Pussu. In summary, in two biunivocally corresponding structures like those that we have described, there is functional solidarity and, as a consequence, simultaneity of processes, i.e., that activity in one structure implies simultaneous activity in the other. A movement of reason causes a simultaneous movement in the cultural structure, the illumination of a system, for example, but a possible movement in the cultural structure, the illumination of a system, for example, simultaneously causes the activity of the rational function. We are thus faced with a vicious cycle in which it does not seem easy to decide, given a simultaneous movement in both structures, which is cause and which is effect. But the solution was already brought forward. In the Pussu, thought is usually produced by the activity of the rational subject. In Article B of this section, we asked what is the force that moves the Pussu's reason? And the answer was, the instinctive will. This would be, then, the force that sets in motion the simultaneous activity of the cultural and cerebral structures. But in the section psychic structure of the animal man or Pussu, the instinctive will was defined as adjusted to multiple conduct patterns that were motivating the behavior to be almost mechanical. The conclusion to be drawn from all this is the following: The Pusu possesses the possibility of developing a psychic subject that generates its own thoughts and causes the activity of reason, while this evolution takes place, and as long as a subject independent of reason is not available, the instinctive will determines the function of reason according to the form of the conduct Parhashurns. Naturally, such Parhashurns are formidable specializations of the animal instinct elaborated over millions of years of the Manu archetype's evolution. As we will see further ahead, it was only when the Hyperborean spirit was enchained to the Pusu that the conscious sphere and the conscious subject developed in these hybrids. The Viryas, the microcosm thus tended toward ontic autonomy, in equal measure as the psychic structure, controlled by the conscious subject, tending toward self-consciousness or individuality. As here we are studying the rational thought of the Pusu, we should forget the Viryas for the moment and accept that the activity of the cultural structure is usually determined by the instinctive.